Also cool.
Yep. So the news that I read this morning that was kind of amusing was the NFL had a pretty big and widespread response to Trump making comments regarding people taking a knee and stuff and saying that those people should just instantly be fired if the coaches and owners are any good. So it's interesting seeing the difference in that kind of nationalistic attitude and kind of the strongman mindset for Trump, where that would make a lot of people really happy. A lot of his base would be pleased by that kind of comment because they already feel like people who are protesting in sports are kind of disrespecting the country as a whole, which isn't necessarily the case. They could be protesting something in particular, and that's fine and valid. But to have the president intervene with that is fairly amusing because you wouldn't have like a Bush president do that, and they're Republican. It's just like it's sports.
Yeah.
Who cares?
No, yeah, it's always a good strategy to throw some meat to your constituents every now and again.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of takes the heat off. And there's been a little bit of heat the past couple weeks on the Trump administration. You know, the Russian investigations are ongoing, tensions with North Korea, the health care bill that the Republicans tried to push through this past week, that fell through.
Mm-hmm.
So there's grounds for criticism, and he's pretty much proven at this point, over the course of his administration thus far, that Donald Trump specifically will kind of throw out these sort of almost non sequitur deviations on Twitter
Mm-hmm.
whenever things get complicated or difficult politically. So he's learning fast. He's learning how to be a politician.
I heard that McCain was a big wrench in the healthcare thing again. He's kind of repeatedly demonstrated to oppose Trump, I think, because Trump has talked shit about him, but also because he's older and he's been more of an establishment Republican in a lot of ways. So if he's the old guard and Trump is kind of a wild card in the White House, McCain doesn't feel obligated to do Trump's bidding because he's been around in this political machine way longer and he's old. So it's kind of like, I don't have much to lose by opposing Trump. And Trump doesn't have the same professionalism that McCain does. Like, you might not agree with McCain's policies, but he understands the politic better.
Hmm. Yeah, I think all of that is true, but I think also John McCain has a long-running reputation that he's, practiced over his career as a moderate Republican, above and beyond some hard right or soft left Republican.
Mm.
Uh, so he's always been kind of cagey about the degree to which he wants reforms like this. And so his opposition here to this new healthcare reform bill that's been pushed by the Republican Party leadership, that's I think that is principled. That does fall within the pattern he's established before. That's not new for him.
Right. So
It's
you're saying it reflects more of his historical stance, not just that he dislikes Trump.
Yeah,
I got you.
yeah, and the bill, and Trump hasn't had a lot to do with the bill really. It's very much been something that's kind of been designed by, Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and those sorts of that upper echelon of Republican congressional leadership.
Yeah.
Trump's role has mostly just been as pusher. He's mostly just been kind of trying to build support for it, sort of cheerleading for it in the background, using his bully pulpit, as they call it, as president to try to get reticent Republicans to support it and to get the constituents, his base, to put pressure on their representatives to vote for it. So it's not really his baby, and I don't think it's really identified closely with him personally, per se.
Mm.
And he was pretty quick to complain about congressional Republicans who voted against it after it failed. So I think Trump and the other opponents, they were more the things that they cited as grounds for opposition was that it was rushed, that it was being pushed along without regard for debate or normal procedure, that they just kind of wanted to get it through as quickly as possible so that they would have something to point to say that they had honored this campaign pledge that they've been making for the better part of a decade, that they would overturn Obamacare. Also, they were trying to. There's some of the actual facets of the bill were controversial. They wanted to remove caps on premiums. Well, rather, they wanted to give states the option to remove caps on premiums, which would allow them to charge significantly more to people, say with well, they can't charge more for people with pre-existing conditions. That rule would stay, but they can charge more for everybody. And then they would also have sharply reduced Medicaid spending over time, from what I read. And all of that was pretty controversial. I mean, even the insurance industries were against it. I think more in their case because of the Medicaid reductions, because that would have eaten a good chunk out of their business. So everybody and their mother was very critical about these changes specifically. And based on those reasons, I think the Republican Party, and specifically John McCain, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, these kinds of people, I think on those grounds they voted against it. And then of course Rand Paul voted against it because he didn't want to vote for anything that wasn't a full-bodied repeal of Obamacare. So there are people on the hard right who refuse to vote for these kinds of what they see as half measures that don't fully get rid of Obamacare and implement a free market healthcare system. So the middle of the Republican Party, sort of the establishment Republicans, are getting squeezed on both ends by moderates and radicals on both wings of the party. And this has happened 2 or 3 times now, I think, with Republican proposals to try to reform the healthcare sector here in the United States. And so this is the latest manifestation of the inability of the party to reconcile its wings. Doesn't seem to be any evidence that that's going to change anytime in the future. It could be that in the future they try to pass something like this, because the principal aspect of this bill was that it gave states, it pretty much pushed responsibility for managing and regulating healthcare to individual states, and it gave them block grants of money with which to do that and to just run their systems as they saw fit. And it might be that they do that again, only in the next iteration of this reform effort they have. They may remove the Medicaid reductions, because those are kind of a sticking point for poorer states and for the healthcare industry. I don't know that there's as much opposition from those groups regarding the removal of caps on premiums. And I think the insurance companies probably would even like to have those caps removed, because then they could charge more and make some more money, which has been a big problem for them. You know, their business model has been imploding slowly over time because of the changes that have been implemented on behalf of Obamacare. Because of Obamacare and on behalf of Obamacare, there's kind of a ecosystem of regulations that had to be passed to make it work. But the healthcare insurance industry has been struggling mightily, and they would probably welcome a removal of those caps. So maybe if they got rid of the Medicaid reductions, there would be much less political opposition, and they could actually get something like this passed. I think moderate Republicans, such as they are, might be more willing to vote in that case. They would still face a lot of opposition from the far right of the Republican Party, the Rand Pauls of the world. But they might be able to get it passed in spite of them. That's a big maybe, because then the Democrats would probably still universally oppose it. It would be close, but it would at least be more feasible. I think that's going to be what the next Republican healthcare bill looks like. Whether or not that passes, though, is still an open question. So let's see, there was a question. Is there any fiscal defense to Graham Cassidy, which was the new Republican healthcare bill? Is there any fiscal defense to it, or is it just an ideological, we must kill Obamacare because we ran on it? Fiscal defense? I don't know if there is a fiscal defense, because I think it would probably it's going to cost the government less with the Medicaid reduction. So certainly there's an argument to be made that it helps reduce the deficit and reduce the burden on the government spending, but I don't think it would be significant. And I think for the most part, it probably is more of an ideological bill. Because earlier, a few months ago, they had made a serious attempt to reform it that was more intricate and tried to be more innovative. I don't know if I could remember the details off the top of my head, but it was a much more all-encompassing bill that was meant to really address far-reaching fundamental problems with the healthcare sector and the healthcare industry in the United States. And that failed for pretty much the same reasons that this bill failed, an inability to reconcile the two wings of the Republican Party. And since that effort failed, there have been, I think, 2 or 3 other attempts, including this one, that have been much less ambitious. They've been much more narrow. And they would not probably really fundamentally address problems in the healthcare sector, either in terms of people lacking accessibility to good healthcare, or to at least affordable healthcare, and then on the other end to the healthcare insurance industry, the health insurance industry, and dealing with their problems. These newer attempts don't really address those problems, and they are more political bills, so to speak, that are meant to give Republicans the ability to just say that they did something, to try to deliver on that campaign pledge that they would overturn Obamacare. So the initial attempt, I think, was legitimate, but after that failed, they've been making increasingly desperate attempts to pass these more political bills that are more about political strategy in the upcoming midterm elections in 2018 than they are about really addressing the fundamental problems that Obamacare was intended to address. Have you been following the drama at the UN the past week?
Nope. What happened there?
So, from what I read, every year the UN has a General Assembly in which they try to get leaders from member countries to come and give speeches, interact, debate, negotiate, etc. And so Donald Trump was there, and naturally that turned into a thing. The UN bureaucracy wasn't too displeased. They were afraid that he was going to come out and just rail on the UN as an institution and demand that it be defunded and get rid of it. And he didn't do that. And in fact, they were pleasantly surprised that Donald Trump's speech, he gave, I think, 2 speeches while he was there. And in one of them, he said, he seemed to imply anyway by his wording that the UN had a role to play in international affairs and that he was not innately opposed to it, that he just wanted change so that it could be more effectual. I don't know what kind of change would make it more effectual. It was never meant to be some all-encompassing global government. Its role and ambition and its role in the world was always supposed to be limited. So I don't know how much change there could be that would be acceptable to every member country. Invariably, there's going to be some that are opposed to certain reforms and then others that are opposed to other reforms. So reaching some kind of consensus on reform in a body that has 80 plus members is going to be difficult regardless of the context of that body. Certainly in the case of the UN, where you have so many different governments and cultures and political cultures in play.
Mm-hmm.
So Trump whined about the UN a little bit, but not as bad as the UN was expecting. The principal drama, though, was with regard to North Korea, because in his second speech, he gave a very hostile, shall we say, speech about the North Korean nuclear program. And then, of course, the North Korean government had to respond to that, and so there was a tit for tat. I took some notes on some of it, and it's not really important. It's not. It doesn't signify dramatic change in the diplomatic balance between the United States and North Korea, or signal the onset of worse relations or the possibility of a war. But it is kind of emblematic of the state of diplomacy between North Korea and the United States. So Trump kind of started things off by saying that if the United States had to defend itself or its allies from North Korea, that he would have to, quote unquote, annihilate North Korea, which is pretty strong language.
Mm-hmm.
He also said that Kim Jong-un is a, quote unquote, rocket man on a suicide mission for himself and his regime. Colorful language.
I don't think he's on a suicide mission. It's more of like the bird that's just flapping its wings and trying to make itself look bigger. That's the thing that's going on with Kim Jong Un, because he's a suicide mission. It doesn't really make sense because then he can no longer rule. He's blowed up. But if he's just flapping his wings and stuff, maybe then the other predators and whatnot will be disinterested, or they feel like, I don't want to mess with them. So it's more of that kind of deterrent. I'm gonna mess you up if you do something to me. It's just talking big.
Yeah, it's signaling, and it's the kind of hand you play when you're playing with a weak hand, or rather, it's the kind of play you make when you have a weak hand. It's if you're a small, weaker power, and we've talked about this before. When you're a small, weaker power, it really behooves you to try to look as crazy as possible in order to discourage aggressive behavior from more powerful rivals. That is one way to deal with that. You could also try to reconcile with your rivals and create an international rules-based regime in which small powers are treated with equal respect to large powers, but North Korea, obviously, specifically the North Korean government, does not seem particularly interested in that avenue for what is probably a variety of reasons, which we could go into, but for now, settle on North Korean government does not trust the intentions of the United States government and wants to preserve the power of its political elites, neither of which are conducive to taking a more diplomatic approach. So Donald Trump also took the opportunity to complain about Iran and the nuclear deal, which he doesn't like, to complain about Venezuela and socialism generally, and to make a jab again about uncontrolled migration. So after that speech, Kim Jong-un, leader of North Korea, replied by comparing Donald Trump to a barking dog, quote unquote, and insulted him, calling him a dotard and mentally deranged. Yeah, dotard. Apparently, it's a very old English term that doesn't get used much anymore. His usage of the word was sufficiently peculiar that the BBC saw it necessary to write an article specifically about the word. Yeah, apparently it dates from the 14th century or the 1400s. I don't quite remember off the top of my head. It basically means you're dumb. A dotard is a person who is dim or stupid. Roughly, that's what it means. So Kim Jong-un broke that word out, called Donald Trump a dotard and mentally deranged, and also said that Trump would, quote, pay dearly for his speech, which he labeled a unprecedented rude nonsense, in his words. I thought this was cute too. The foreign minister of North Korea was asked what he thought about Trump's comments, and he said that he, quote, felt sorry for his aides, end quote. He also added that he thought that Trump's threats were irreversible mistakes that made it inevitable that North Korean missiles would hit the U.S. And I think he repeated the claim that, specifically the quote is that Trump is mentally deranged and full of megalomania, and that Trump was on a suicide mission, kind of reflecting Trump's earlier words.
No, it's basically a no you.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. That's it in a nutshell. It's not a particularly mature debate, suffice to say. So in other North Korea news, there was the United States also flew some bombers along North Korea's northeastern coast as a quote-unquote show of force in order to basically just intimidate them. As kind of part of that overarching debate, in so much as you can call that a debate. There was also a quake detected at the launch site where some of the recent missile tests in North Korea were launched. That quake there was some suspicion that it might have been another test, but experts around the world said that they don't think so. They think it probably is a natural quake, not a man-made one. The implication being that it might be the result of the previous test, the previous nuclear test, but is not in and of itself a new nuclear test. And the big thing recently, I think this was yesterday, China and Russia agreed to new sanctions, and specifically sanctions on oil and textiles. And the reason those were targeted in particular was that, for one, North Korea derives a good chunk of its foreign revenue, its foreign currency rather, from the export of textiles. I think specifically to China, which then turns around and exports them elsewhere. So China has put restrictions on the import of North Korean textiles, and then China has also agreed to sanctions on oil exports to North Korea, and that's important with regard to China. Because most of North Korea's oil imports, most of North Korea's oil in general, I think, comes from China. The sanctions do not completely bar exports of oil from China. Rather, it curtails them. I believe the number was China is limited to exporting a total of 2 million barrels of oil per year to North Korea now. And the estimate I read was that they had been exporting something like 2.2 million barrels. So 200,000 short, North Korea will lose that extra 200,000 barrels of oil because of these sanctions. And while a complete bar on exports would have been more impactful, this way at least there's room for further sanctions down the road. You know, if you just bar all exports right now, you kind of limit yourself in what further sanctions you could do if the North Korean government continues down this road.
Yeah.
So they leave themselves some room there in terms of further sanctions. So it's not completely a bad thing. There is some logic to it. So the state of play right now is to see what North Korea does now that the new sanctions are in place. They've been complaining pretty hard that new sanctions would only make things worse and that they would never give up the program, even if there were restrictions on oil and other new sanctions. And China and Russia, and we discussed this last week, China and Russia were beginning to get a little antsy about passing further sanctions. They didn't think there would be much point, and they thought it was getting to a juncture where the Korean government they were afraid it might collapse at some point if the sanctions became draconian. But because the North Korean government launched new missile tests in the past week, I think we talked about that last week. I think that was the case that they were passing the sanctions on, launching a missile over Japan. Because of that incident, they changed their minds, or at least changed their tact, and have agreed to these new sanctions. Whether or not they'll continue to do so is an open question, since they still seem to be a little bit reticent. But for now, anyway, they're on the train, as they're on the same page with the rest of the world in terms of an escalating degree of sanctions as North Korea's government continues to test their missiles and continues their nuclear program. So that's the North Korea circus over the past week.
Yeah. Kind of seems fairly similar to business as usual.
Yeah, nothing new, just some entertaining new clowns, as it were.
I wonder if, like, from the human perspective, if Kim Jong-un is happy with Trump just because it makes it more fun. He's not alone. He's got a peer now in the barking game. Because they called Trump a barking dog, and then, like, that's their game. So it's kind of like, hey, you're doing our thing. A little bit jealous.
Yeah, it's definitely a very new, shall we say, diplomatic strategy being employed on the part of the United States government. It's the rhetoric being used at the presidential level is probably, I think it's unprecedented, certainly for the 20th century. So the tack the Trump administration has taken has been very hostile and very much more tit for tat, so to speak, in terms of rhetoric, whereas previous administrations were pretty content to just focus on substance. In that sense, I think it is probably more colorful for Kim Jong-un personally in terms of how he crafts his responses. I think everybody was pretty enamored with his using the word dotard. Whether or not he went out of his way to throw that in just to be creative, or whether he thinks that's a pretty normal word in English, it's up to the individual to decide. I have no idea.
Well, one of the consequences of them being a hermit kingdom is they're not really up to date with the current use of English.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. There are downsides to completely cutting yourself off from the rest of the world.
Yep.
Well, there was some other action at the UN General Assembly too, and this was much more mundane. It was a spat between Pakistan and India. Basically, the Pakistani rep at the UN gave a speech accusing India of quote-unquote war crimes in Kashmir. And specifically, he referenced the use of pellet guns by riot control police in Kashmir. There have been a number of riots and different forms of unrest in Kashmir over the past year or two that followed the death of a well-known, popular insurgent leader who had been fighting against Indian rule in Kashmir. He was a younger guy who had a strong social media presence, and that sparked a lot of unrest once he was killed. And dealing with the unrest, riot police will use these pellet guns to just, kind of shoot people. They're meant to be non-lethal weapons, but the accusation is that the riot police are aiming for the eyes of the protesters, and there have been a number of cases of generally younger people, a lot of them kids, who have been hit in the eyes by pellets from these pellet guns and blinded. And so the Pakistani rep was accusing India of war crimes. And so then there's apparently a quote-unquote right of response in the UN Assembly. So nations have the opportunity to respond to accusations made against them by other countries. So the India rep came up and gave a speech excoriating Pakistan over a number of issues. He accused Pakistan of exporting global terrorism, of trying to control the territory of neighbors. That's specifically a reference to Kashmir. And my favorite bit was when he referred to Pakistan as Terroristan, which was terribly mature, and basically went on to rip into Pakistan as much as he could. So that's kind of the UN for you. It's not meant to solve the world's problems. It's meant to be a venue for leaders to get together to discuss how they might solve the world's problems. And unfortunately, they do not always indulge themselves in that opportunity, preferring instead charades of this variety. So let's see. There was some more questions. It might be useful to talk briefly about how discussion of a topic does not equate to support of said point of topic. I mean, yeah, that's innate. I mean, describing something or talking about the politics behind something is not in itself an endorsement. That's just talking about it, I share information as I understand it and as I read it. I don't endorse one side or the other.
Yeah, to put it in simple terms, it's kind of like talking about the game state in a sporting event as opposed to necessarily cheering for a sports team by describing what they're doing. I think in a lot of senses we assume that you have to pick a side in any given kind of situation involving two factions, but to just describe this is what this side of the story is doing and this is what the other team is doing, it doesn't mean that you're cheering for one or the other. You're just kind of doing exactly that, describing the state of the game. Mm-hmm. And some people aren't familiar with that format where it's not about you and me arguing left versus right politics in general. That's, I think, a lot of what turns people off to listening to political stuff is they feel like it's more of the sports game as opposed to the news and current events, which is more of kind of a neutral presentation of information, and then the viewer or the reader can interpret that for themselves.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I try to be impartial. I try to be as objective as I can and to try to just present information so that people can kind of decide for themselves, rather than passing judgment. I think part of this stems from a little bit of trouble I got into last week because I chose my words poorly. I said that I didn't subscribe to the notion that the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 because of oil or other such reasons. And that sparked a minor revolt in chat from what I read. What I should have said is that I thought the evidence that the United States invaded Iraq for oil is weak, which is not substantially different, but it's more objective. I should have used better phrasing in that regard. By the way, this is an opportunity to talk about this because somebody in chat last week brought up this number that 1 million people in Iraq died because of the Iraq War, and that number is actually almost certainly not correct because it's based on a flawed study that was done in, I think, 2007. And I remember reading about it in 2007 when the results were first released, and there was a lot of criticism of it even then. It's a number that floats around a lot in ideological circles on the far right and the far left in particular. Anybody who's very anti-war or is very critical of the Iraq War and is very ideologically predisposed on one side or the other will use this number. It's mostly been used by those people. And the problem with the study was that the study was meant to figure out, trying to infer just how many people had died in the war up to that point. And in order to do that, the methodology they used was to go into, I think it was Fallujah, and certain other areas of Iraq that had been hit by the insurgency particularly hard. Specifically the center part of the country where most of the Sunni population lives. That was sort of the heart of the insurgency in Iraq. And they asked people they asked individuals who were willing to participate, how many people they knew who had died in fighting, who had been killed in some form or fashion related to the conflict. And so based on the responses, they formulated a rate, so to speak, and then they extrapolated that rate to the whole country. And you can see the flaw in that because you're taking a rate that's based on the incidence of violence in the most violent part of Iraq, and then extrapolating it to the rest of Iraq, which implicitly assumes that the rest of Iraq is just as violent as the part of Iraq that you took the survey in. And that's patently false. I mean, that's like going into Chicago and asking what the crime rate is and then assuming, okay, well, that must be the crime rate for the rest of the United States.
Yeah.
And then deriving a number of, trying to predict the number of crimes that occur in the United States based on that Chicago rate.
Seems like an upper limit estimate rather than like what would be expected as the true estimate or the average.
Yeah, that's the problem. You know, the north of Iraq, the Kurdish area, was very peaceful, relatively speaking, throughout the Iraq War, and even almost up till now, save for the parts of Kurdistan that were invaded and occupied by the Islamic State. And even the southern part of Iraq, the predominantly Shia part, which had some violence. There was some Shia militias that fought against the United States and also fought against political rivals within the Shia political community. But even there, it was much less violent than in the Sunni parts of Iraq, where the insurgency was at its worst. And so the assumption then that you can take a rate of violence from the Sunni part of Iraq, from the insurgent hit part of Iraq, and extrapolate that to the south and north, that doesn't hold water. That's not good methodology. You would really have to, in order to take a representative sample of the total population of Iraq, you would really have to travel to different parts of Iraq and sample different populations. But this study only did one part of Iraq in one particular community. And they ended up with this huge number, 1 million, based on that. So generally, the consensus is that the number of people died, the upper bound, so to speak, is generally considered to be about 250,000, about 250,000, which is still a lot.
Yeah.
But that's the upper estimate. Most estimates average a bit lower than that. And the 1 million number is generally discredited. It's not really considered to be viable. So certainly, I'm not going to tell people what to believe. Maybe the United States invaded Iraq because of oil, maybe not. I think the evidence is weak. I don't believe that. And that 1 million number is bogus for methodological reasons. Let's see, so there was another question here. Oh, well, to kind of cap off that previous conversation. Yeah, just because I talk about something, or talk about it in a certain way, I know some people were complaining about my tone last week. Just because I talk about something or talk about it in a certain way doesn't mean I endorse it. I try to be impartial, believe what you want to believe, make of what I say what you will. And, you know, if I don't do that well, if I'm not properly impartial, then by all means, tell me in chat, because I want to improve. You know, I want to be able to present myself in a way that people are willing to listen to. It doesn't really help if people just shut you out right away because they think you're partisan. So I want to be able to speak to people in a way that they don't find offensive right off the bat. So by all means, you know, post in chat if you find something I say partial rather, or some such. so that I can work on that and so that we can improve the quality of discussion.
I've noticed with just success of conversation and debate, if people peg you as an opponent, they're less interested in what you have to say, and they're going to be more focused on beating you, as though it's now a contest or a battle, as opposed to two people sharing the information they have to try and get closer to the truth.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I've noticed that in chat, because there have been some people over the past couple months that will get triggered by something, and then they'll just go off, like for the rest of the runtime, for as long as they can. They'll just complain. But we've talked about other controversial things, probably more controversial things than those things that triggered those people, and then people didn't seem as offended. You know, in the cases where people can talk about something controversial without losing their shit, conversation can play out and an exchange of ideas can happen. But when people get very sensitive, very offended, you know, they get very confrontational, that exchange can't really happen, and it becomes more of a contest.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to watch that play out in different iterations over the past few months. Yeah, chat is kind of like a social experiment in that regard. It's providing interesting data. It's one of the reasons I like to read it after these episodes. So let's see. Somebody asked, can I talk about what are my thoughts on the German election, if I have any? I did have some notes. I hadn't really been following it closely because it didn't really seem to be a very close election. It seemed like everybody was pretty confident about the ultimate outcome. Let me see if I can find what I wrote about it. Here we go. Yeah, so the predicted result was that Merkel and her party, the CDU and CSU coalition, would basically win. That's what happened. No shock there. The only real surprise is that they didn't win by as much as they thought they would. It was a little bit disappointing. Not as disappointing as for the SPD, which is the sort of institutional leftist party, the establishment leftist party in Germany. They only got, I think, 20% of the vote, and that was very disappointing for them. Before, in the previous election, the SPD and Merkel's party, the conservatives, they had gotten not necessarily the exact same proportion of the vote. I think the conservatives ended up with a bit more, but it was relatively close, such that a grand coalition between the left and right in Germany was possible. And so Germany has actually been governed by a grand coalition between the major left and right parties for the past, however many years it's been. I don't quite recall exactly. But now the SPD has gotten a sufficiently small share of the vote that they're almost certainly not going to be in a coalition again. So they're going to be in opposition going forward. It's looking like the future governing coalition is going to be between Merkel's conservatives and two other political parties. One, the FDP, the Free Democratic Party. I don't remember exactly what it stands for. Basically, they're sort of the libertarians in Germany, roughly speaking. That's the FDP, and then the Green Party, which is more the environmentalist party. That's thought to be the most likely outcome as far as coalition negotiations. The only hitch might come from the Greens. They apparently want to shut down something. From what I read, it was something like 20 coal-fired plants, which is problematic because that's a good chunk of the electricity, the source of electricity in Germany. So apparently there might be some tension there with the CDU, but apparently the consensus is that that's going to get worked out and that they'll be part of the coalition that results eventually in the new government. Let's see. I think some of my North Korea notes ended up here somehow. I don't think anybody in Germany called Trump surely indefinitely mentally deranged and a U.S. dotard. Yeah, so the other kind of outcome was that Merkel had promised to address some of the concerns of voters for the AfD in order to try to win them back. The AfD is sort of this far-right party in Germany that kind of cropped up over the past 5-6 years, sort of in response to the immigration crisis, and also to a lesser degree because of the Eurozone crisis. The Eurozone crisis is kind of when they started up, but it was the immigration crisis that really fired them up and gave them power. One of the surprises in the election was that the AFD did a lot better than people were expecting. It was thought that they might get something like between 5 to 10% of the vote, and they ended up with 13% of the vote. So they superseded expectations and are now they're going to have seats and a significant number of seats in the German Bundestag. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So that's a bit surprising, but nobody seems to want to work with them, either on the right or left. So it's unlikely that they're going to be a part of any eventual coalition. But they do have a lot of they do have more influence than they did before, and it's sufficient that major political parties are catering a little bit now to that sentiment on people, among people on the far right, in order to try to attract those voters. And in the Economist article I read, some of the issues that could crop up in the next couple of years that could invigorate the AFD and give them further power would be a new migrant wave or more terrorist attacks. There's also stagnant wages amongst the bottom 40% of income earners in Germany. That could be fodder for a populist wave. And then there's also, just kind of like in the rest of Europe, there's a growing low-wage service sector that a lot of people are getting wrapped in, and that people are finding employment in because of a lack of opportunities in other sectors. So all of that could lead to votes for the AFD in a future election. So I don't have a lot of significant thoughts on it, but that's roughly a summary of it. That's just a quick rundown. Yeah, the low wage issue, the growth of low wage jobs in Germany, kind of like the rest of Europe, that's partly a result of a compromise, and I think the Germans actually dealt with it better than other European countries with this compromise. Basically, the compromise was, well, the genesis of it was that German companies, specifically manufacturers, were not sufficiently competitive. They were losing business to foreign competition, and they wanted to become more competitive. But, just like everybody else, they faced a lot of political resistance to reforms that would have allowed them to basically lower wages and cut jobs. So they reached a compromise with labor, with the German government basically acting as a third party to keep wages the same, but to lower working hours. And the idea was to prevent mass layoffs. Everybody kind of kept their job, but they were making less money because there were fewer hours. And via that compromise, and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but via this compromise, German companies, manufacturing companies, were able to get what they wanted. They were able to become more competitive. They were able to kind of reduce hours and the total amount they spent on workers. And in that way, were able to reinvigorate their profits and become globally competitive. And they've been sort of benefiting from that ever since. I think the reforms were passed around 2000, 2001 under the Schroeder government back in the day. And they've been pretty effective. But in general, even though the manufacturing sector continues to do well, there's still a lack of opportunity for a good swath of people, specifically people with high school education. There's a growing number of people who have to resort to the sort of gig economy, as it's come to be called. And that comes with a lot of insecurity and relatively low wages. And the German government hasn't come up with any better solutions than anybody else has in terms of dealing with that. You can make the labor market more flexible such that it's easier to hire and fire. You would probably end up with more jobs then, but they would probably be low-wage, insecure jobs of that same type, so no significant improvement there. On the other hand, you could significantly raise taxes and have the government spend a lot to give welfare payments to people to try to make sure that they're not too bad off, but then you're kind of back to the problem Germany was in the 90s, when they were under a lot of pressure to reduce government spending because of a lack of economic dynamism. The economy wasn't growing enough to support the social welfare state, such as it was at the time, and so cuts had to be implemented. That was also part of that reform package that involved keeping wages the same but cutting hours. So there's no clear-cut solution there to that problem, and that again could be fodder for the AFD if that gets worse in the future. They could campaign on dealing with that. I don't know what they would do exactly, but populists generally aren't known for their details. their attention to detail. Generally, they just come out and say, "We're going to do this in a way that you're going to like. That's going to avoid all of the pain of the normal recommendations for dealing with an issue, uh, but we'll address it nonetheless."
One little linguistic improvement is in the gaming culture, we have triggered as kind of a meme for making fun of people who have bad experiences, some kind of trauma, and then baiting them in conversation either with jokes or topics that kind of trigger them in the medical sense, as opposed to the example you were talking about in our last session was some people getting butt hurt, which is more people who are still functioning just fine, but they got upset because you're taking a stance opposite of theirs and they get all riled up. So that's just a minor kind of linguistic thing that if you're if you're not on the shores of all these Twitch streams, it might not be evident because you're using the word is technically correct in the sense that there was a trigger that activated them to behave in a certain way, but it's been kind of confounded with this trolling use of the term, as opposed to just when someone's upset in the basic sense.
Fair enough. Yeah, in general, I recognize the right of people to be butthurt. You know, if you believe in something fervently, then it shouldn't be a surprise then when you have an issue with somebody who says something that you think is ethically dubious or immoral. You know, in that case, you kind of have a prerogative to speak out and speak your mind.
Yeah.
So I don't have a problem with that. You know, if I say something you disagree with, by all means, point it out, post in chat about it, share your opinion. And again, I try to be impartial such that that isn't an issue, such that people aren't offended like that. But again, if it happens, by all means, go ahead and do it. I would prefer people not troll, such as it were, but of course it's the internet, so that's inevitable. Yeah. I don't even have a problem with that. So yeah, it's a free market of ideas. It's a chaotic, unregulated ideological market. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of churn. I recognize that. So I just want to. Oh, sorry?
I think we've talked before about how anonymity and the kind of layers of social insulation on the internet can produce some different types of bad behavior that wouldn't necessarily occur face to face, because you're less likely of getting punched out or beaten up by a crowd or something, and you can kind of represent your darker side a little bit more than you would if your name was being represented. So we have a little mini example in this last match I just played. I played against a Terran opponent who's a barcode, meaning they don't have a name attached where they have no reputation to defend, and they were doing a lot of things that are very clearly considered bad manner. They're dropping mules on my face and they're pausing and unpausing really fast when they've won the game. And that same type of person, would they do that if they had a reputation to defend? Maybe, maybe not. It seems clear that they wanted to invest in a barcode to be able to get away with that kind of thing, because the community, generally speaking, frowns on that type of thing. And you have forums and message boards, and the barrier for making a Twitch account is very low, so people will do all kinds of silly things that they wouldn't do if their reputation was on the line.
Well, I mean, that's just kind of the culture of the internet as it's evolved over time. It's just become that way because of that chaotic environment. And, there is some merit to having a chaotic environment, to having this completely unvarnished space where you can just speak your mind, or pretend to speak your mind and just troll, whatever you want to do. It's kind of a commentary on human nature in some ways.
Yeah.
There was I don't remember who said it, but there's a famous quote, and it went something like, "Give a man a mask and he'll show you his true face."
Yeah.
And the internet is kind of an extrapolation of that argument. Give vast populations anonymity, and they'll really show you what they believe. They'll really kind of show you their nature. And a lot of the internet, in so much as it's still completely unregulated, not every part of it is anymore, unfortunately, but the parts of it that are completely unregulated really kind of give you some insights into human nature and the way people interact and think. And I think that has value. Whatever warts and problems may come with it, I think that in and of itself has value.
Yeah, it increases the breadth of possible communication, which I think brings out good and bad things on either side, where you can have people who can make progress on fronts where they wouldn't be able to otherwise, and also people who kind of like the current wave of internet neo-Nazis, where they get to have their little parties and people don't really mess with them too much. Reddit set some interesting precedents lately, and there was actually a study on how people behave toward those who are overweight, whether the fat people hate subreddit is available or not. And they did a study of a lot of these accounts of users who were regular posters there, and then after the subreddit was banned, they either ended their accounts or they changed their behavior a little bit. So sites like Reddit and places where they create those open forums have quite a bit of power in shifting the way that people communicate as well. 4chan is kind of the example of the Wild West site that's mostly maintained that kind of role, where it's just anything goes, pretty much.
Yeah, we'll see where it goes. There seems to be a trend towards more regulation, so it could be on its way out. We may be sort of in the last stage of the internet's Wild West period.
Yeah.
But there's still time, who's to say? Maybe things will turn around.
There are also kind of potential areas where features like that are supposed to clean things up kind of cause their own problems. So in Dota 2, they have an in-game report feature that's very easy to use and very fast to use. And a lot of people just use that when they don't like the performance of a player on the team, as opposed to someone who's actively throwing the game or being really bad manner or something. It's just like, this person picked techies, I'm just going to report them.
Yeah, I was reading, I think today, about Facebook was, there's been a lot of pressure, more and more pressure brought on Facebook to try to moderate its what gets posted on its medium on Facebook. And one of the mechanisms they implemented involved automatic removal, basically, and so that pending review, anyway. And one of the things that got removed was a channel that was documenting atrocities being committed against the Rohingya in Burma. And the channel was innocent in the sense that it wasn't posting the videos, which were very violent and graphic, for titillation or entertainment. It was meant to try to bring attention to a serious issue in Burma, specifically with regard to this very oppressed and persecuted minority. But there were complaints made to Facebook about the video, probably from Burma, and so Facebook rather, removed the channel and all of the videos. And they had something like 60,000 subscribers, so they'd been getting a fair amount of attention. So, obviously that's an easy thing to fix. They could just go back and undo it, but when you're dealing with so many videos, so much content, and you have so few people policing it, it's very hard to police it in a way that's just, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we've talked about with like finding news and stuff is also being able to identify what Facebook's biases are, because we kind of think of it as the big general social media platform, but they do have their biases as well, and they're not super transparent. I would say most Facebook users aren't really aware of how Facebook chooses what information is made available versus what isn't.
Yeah, that's probably accurate. I think they, from what I've read anyway, Facebook is very cagey about its practices. And I wonder if that isn't partly just so that they can avoid regulatory attention. The governments and political actors have a tendency to moral panic, in which case they tend to pass legislation or rules or demand action on the part of agencies or economic actors to make changes that can be very expensive or otherwise intrusive, that ultimately don't end up being very effective. I know Prime Minister May over in the United Kingdom, I think over the past week, gave a speech that not just Facebook, but social media in general, that social media entities should do a lot more to police their content, such that they should remove any, I think terrorist propaganda specifically was what she mentioned, that they should remove any extremist or terrorist propaganda, any extremist content or terrorist propaganda within 2 hours of it being posted. Which is an ambitious request.
Even if it's in the middle of the night.
Yeah. It's just very hard to follow. Well, specifically 2 hours. You can remove extremist content. Social media entities have made a point to try to at least to do that, but to remove it within 2 hours, that's asking a lot. That would require a lot of effort on the part of the companies. It would require a lot more people, most likely.
Yeah.
I would imagine. Again, and I've said this before, I'm not a tech guy, so this is a bit out of my ambit. This is more of a Kukio subject. He would have known a lot more about it. Let's see. So the next question was, I've been learning a lot about how food affected history recently and was curious if I had any thoughts on beer. In particular, beer with the rise of civilization and possibly the change from beer to wine in the early civilizations. If not that in particular, I kind of just want to talk about food history with regard to socioeconomics, since I've been reading about food history with regard to history, and I wanted to know about historical economics in relation to food history. Okay. It's kind of a multi-part question. I don't know much about the history of beer, so I can't comment on that really. Maybe the closest I could come is to say that it was not the principal source of nutrition, but it was unimportant. It was just one of the important sources of nutrition in medieval Europe. I think more in Central Europe, where they had a particularly thick type of beer. Maybe it was mead, actually. And they would actually drink that as a source of protein, if I'm remembering it correctly anyway. And, that it was just one part of the diet, but disproportionately important, much more so than now. Beyond that, though, I don't know much about beer, so I can't comment too much on that, or its relation to the rise of civilization, or the change of beer to wine. I don't know anything about that in early civilizations. But in general, the broader question was with food history with regard to socioeconomics. The first thing that comes to mind is the first civilizations, the first city-states that I think were in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Basically, the innovation of agriculture, such as it was then, the idea of farming food, basically farming the food that you eat, farming crops, allowed for the first time a significant buildup in food surplus. You could grow and have a lot more food than you needed. And because you had a lot more food than you needed, then you could, basically society in general had enough food left over to feed people who were not directly involved in farming. Relatively few people could farm significant amounts of food, and then that surplus could feed basically cities. You could have people who just lived in cities and did nothing to produce food, who did other things, who did things like write, produce art, govern, form armies, just any number of things, whatever you like. Basically, civilization and urban culture specifically rests on food surplus. And so civilization in part got started by early agriculture producing that surplus. And since then, that surplus has continued to grow. Obviously, fewer and fewer people as a proportion of the total population produce a larger and larger amounts of food, such that the surplus grows and we can have just immense teeming cities with tens of millions of people. I think Mexico City has a cosmopolitan area of over 20 million people. Probably very few of whom are directly involved in actually producing food, but they don't all starve because there's that huge surplus. So that's the first thing that comes to mind with food history and civilization. I'd have to think about it more to get into more detail than that. I'm sure you could argue that it's had strategic implications, but that kind of goes beyond the ambit of civilization. I could talk about in terms of economic history and trade, but that's not necessarily growing civilization. That's just, trade in general is a hallmark of civilization at any stage of history. So the Roman Empire traded significantly with North Africa, which was kind of its breadbasket. But beyond the strategic and economic implications, I don't know that that really had broader ramifications for the Roman Empire and Roman civilization. you could talk about land history in terms of who owns land. That ties into food history to a degree, but it doesn't have to do with food directly. So that's kind of getting off onto a tangent a bit. Different societies have had different means of managing that. Generally, very fertile areas kind of almost have a plantation type system, where you have large groups of workers farming, and then a couple of people will own all the land. In China, not so much, and in Europe, not so much. Generally, there were smaller landholders distributed more evenly across the land mass. In places like North India, for example, generally it was more large landowners lording over a large number of workers. But again, that's getting away from food history specifically. Yeah, I would really have to think about it more to give a substantive answer that really caters specifically to that topic, because I'm not a big food historian. There's not much coming to mind immediately that really relates to food history specifically. So my apologies, I wish I had more to offer, but I'd have to look into it, to be honest. So then the next question was, does it make sense for the federal government to invest funds in Puerto Rico to help them recover from their natural disasters? I mean, from a humanitarian perspective, yes, it would make sense. I think the question more is there a legal obligation? And I don't think there is. And I don't think that the federal government or the broader American electorate really feels much of a need to. Puerto Rico is, for those who don't know, if you're from outside the United States or unfamiliar with Puerto Rico is a part of the United States of America. It's an American territory, but it's not a state. It's an island in the Caribbean that was conquered basically from Spain in the Spanish-American War in, I want to say, 1898, something around there. And the island was taken as an American territory and governed from Washington. It's governed by the federal government of the United States. But it is not a state, and it has a lot of autonomy. It has self-government. They vote for their own government, and largely it runs its own affairs. There's not a whole lot of oversight on the part of the federal government of the United States. Really, the extent of American control is that the U.S. Constitution applies to Puerto Rico, and I think that's about it. So, other than that, almost entirely self-governing, and that's probably not entirely correct. There's probably some other details I'm missing, but that's my memory of it. And there's been some question as to whether Puerto Rico should declare independence, or whether they should apply for statehood, formal statehood in the United States. There's a population of something like, I think, 2 to 3 million in Puerto Rico, which means Puerto Rico actually has a larger population than a number of U.S. states. I think Wyoming has less than 1 million people in it. So in terms of population, there are certainly grounds for it to become a state. But anyway, the statehood argument is kind of a different issue. Puerto Rico got hit really hard by the recent hurricane or hurricanes. I think one in particular, what was it, Irma, I think is the one that hit it dead on. And basically, power has been knocked out for the entire island, and it's just been devastated, and it's not been good. And this is on top of the already existent fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico. Basically, Puerto Rico is bankrupt. They don't have money, or they can't borrow more money to pay for services, and so there have been massive cuts in social services of all kinds. So the hurricane was not well timed. It's kind of exacerbating a problem that was already in crisis, that had already reached crisis proportions. Whether or not it makes sense for the federal government to invest, that's kind of a subjective question. Whether or not the federal government will help Puerto Rico, I'm sure there will be some FEMA funding. FEMA is the emergency, sort of the natural disaster agency in the U.S. government. I think that I would imagine anyway that FEMA would probably send some assistance. I don't know if there's any legal obligation for them to do so. I don't know enough about the legalities of Puerto Rico and emergency assistance. Whether or not the federal government will go full throat, go full out to try to help Puerto Rico, though, I doubt it. I don't think the federal government will go any further in helping Puerto Rico than it does states. And really, the federal assistance to states is kind of limited. It's mostly some funding, some FEMA operations, but by and large, states kind of deal with these problems with natural disasters themselves. FEMA is just meant to kind of help on top of state efforts. Puerto Rico will largely help itself in that regard, in so much as it can. I don't know that there's much beyond that. Yeah, because you could go into, well, is there an economic argument for the would it be better for the United States to help the Puerto Rico economy recover? Well, yeah, it would, but the United States doesn't help states for that reason. The United States government doesn't generally go out of its way to help states deal with downturns of an economic downturns or other problems like that. So I don't think the federal government would make a special case for Puerto Rico in that regard. In terms of a political argument, I guess you could say the federal government should help them to make it more likely that they don't declare independence and stop being a territory of the United States, but I don't think there's that much interest in retaining Puerto Rico as a territory. I think the attitude in Washington over the past few decades has been declare independence, become a state, or stay with the status quo. We don't really care. You're not really that important to us. It's kind of a small island. It's not really that strategically located, and so it's not really a priority for Washington to kind of deal with Puerto Rico as an issue, so to speak, as evidenced by the fact that Puerto Rico's bankruptcy, or at least defaulting on its debt, such as it was, blew over in Washington basically almost without a word. There was very little comment on it because hardly anybody really cared. And there was a follow-up question here. Does Agent Smith believe Puerto Rico would want to become a state or declare independence? Yeah, there is some support for it. There has been a movement for independence. I think the movement for independence was strongest in the 1950s. But that was also around the time when the federal government, when Washington started devolving more autonomy to the Puerto Rican government, and so that seemed to take the air out of that movement. So they've always kind of been there. There's always been about like a third of the electorate in Puerto Rico that wants independence. There's also about roughly a third that wants to become a state, and then roughly a third that wants to just stay the way things are, that wants to keep the status quo. And generally, every 10 years or 15 years, there's been an election held, in a referendum, I should say, in Puerto Rico about the future of the territory, and the status quo has always won. Generally not by much. Generally, it's like between 50 to 60% of the vote goes for, basically against the status quo in one form or another. But there's never been a decisive vote for independence or statehood. They're kind of divided in terms of what they want, and so that because there's such a big gap between independence and being a state in the United States, the people who want the status quo have always been able to kind of win out, taking advantage of that fact. Because if you hold a referendum on, do you want to become independent, the people who want to be a state will vote with the people who want the status quo against independence. But then if you have a referendum on statehood, all of the people who want independence vote with the people who want the status quo, and then that referendum fails. So the status quo innately has the advantage in that regard, because there's not a lot of agreement between the other two factions, so to speak, on the issue. So yeah, there's definitely people in Puerto Rico who want statehood and independence, but there's not a decisive enough majority in either of those groups to swing a referendum one way or the other. So the most likely outcome going forward is status quo. Let's see, the next question was, is Trump doing a good job in your opinion? I think the definition of good job for the president usually refers to the way he is handling foreign relationships, how he is handling domestic affairs, etc. Is he doing a good job? I mean, a lot of that is subjective. Obviously his political supporters, his constituents, they think he's doing a good job. From what I've read and heard, a lot of those people are really gung-ho for him. They're still pretty excited about him. There's been some disappointment on individual policies. People were disappointed about his sort of what they saw as reneging on campaign promises regarding DACA, that the legislation about children who were illegally brought to the United States but who grew up here and are basically Americans. That's the DACA bill, and that his stance on that was more conciliatory, and that disappointed some of his people. And I think there's been some disappointment about the lack of movement in terms of his ostensible economic nationalist agenda. But beyond that, they're still broadly supportive of him. On the left, people hate him. That hasn't changed. That's pretty much, that was true before he was even elected. On the part of the, I guess what you would call the establishment right, for lack of a better phrase, there's still a great deal of discomfort on their part about Trump. They don't want to come out explicitly against him because they don't want to aggravate his supporters, whom could turn on them and launch a number of primary campaigns against establishment candidates. They would sooner avoid that kind of confrontation. But they're not really comfortable with his brand of conservatism either. They think it emphasizes social conservatism at the expense of the economic conservatism that the establishment Republican Party, that group of people, values. They're much more about business and economic management, and generally they don't care as much about the social issues. So basically, is Trump doing a good job? That's subjective. You're asking, in my opinion. Yeah, my opinions don't really carry a lot of weight, really, and I'm a little wary about handing them out. I will say that I've always been pretty skeptical of Donald Trump in general. I didn't really like him that much even before he started running for president. I didn't like him when he was running for president, and I don't particularly like him now. So in that sense, full disclosure, I'm not a big Trump guy. Trying to be impartial, trying to be objective, there are some things he's done better on. Foreign policy, a lot of people were afraid of what he was going to do on foreign policy, but he's been relatively restrained compared to the fears of what he would do. So that's been a plus. He's been, I think, the best thing that he's done is to reach out to Democrats in so much as he's done it. There hasn't been a whole lot of it, but he's made encouraging signs that he's willing to negotiate with Democrats and reach out to them. And that's kind of a nice change from the partisan equilibrium that's been holding in Washington for the past couple decades, which has made it increasingly difficult for even well-meaning people in one party or the other to reach out to the opposition, to reach out to people in other parties and try to reach a compromise. Compromise has kind of become a dirty word in Washington politics. So he's made some encouraging signs that he's willing to take the political risk of compromise and negotiating with political opponents.
Compromise.
I think, yeah. So I think that's a positive development. I think that's a good shift. If he would, I think it would serve him well and the country as a whole if he would focus more on that. But in terms of the rhetoric and a lot of the things he says on Twitter, I don't think any of that is really helping him. I don't much approve of that. But again, that's just me. Make of that what you will. So let's see. The next question was, what are your thoughts on the New Zealand election, in particular in relation to the laws against politicians knowingly lying in the 2 weeks up to the election, and the fact that pre-votes are taken almost 2 months before the election? I don't know a whole lot about the New Zealand election. I can't say that I was really following it that closely. What I read about it was that there was a virtual tie, that the election was held just recently, and no particular political party really came out ahead. So there's kind of fervent negotiations taking place between the left and the right party with this sort of nationalist party that got a minority of the vote, but whose support is going to be necessary to form a governing coalition. So basically this nationalist party, sounds a little weird to talk about New Zealand nationalism, but that's a thing. This nationalist New Zealand party is basically kingmaker. Whichever of the two major political parties they agree to go into a coalition with will govern for the foreseeable future until the next election. So they're in a good position to get a lot of concessions from whichever party is willing to make a deal with them to get power. That's about the extent of what I've read about it. So I don't know a lot about New Zealand laws about lying or what lying politicians in New Zealand may have done in the election. As far as pre-votes taken 2 months before the election, in general, there's some criticism about having allowing people to vote before the actual election, basically mailing in your vote ahead of time. The idea being that people that people kind of don't get a chance to incorporate events that occur between the time they mail in their vote before they vote beforehand. What they call in the United States early voting. Basically, if something big happens between the time they vote and the election, then they don't get the opportunity to change their vote. You know, they're kind of giving up the ability to incorporate new information as it comes up. So there's some criticism in that regard. There's also criticism about voting fraud, at least here in the United States, although that's heavily politicized. So there is a question about whether or not it's a good idea to have these long lead times in which people can vote early. Within the context of New Zealand, I can't really speak to that. I'm not as familiar with that, so I couldn't really, I can't really comment. Yeah, I didn't read as much this week because I've been really busy with proofreading. Been having to do a lot of proofreading. Yeah, it turns out that proofreading 100-page dissertations is very difficult. So, for any of you aspiring proofreaders, keep that in mind. Adjust your schedule accordingly.
It's not as glamorous as you think.
How much do you know about the Opium Wars, and what are your thoughts on the economic side of the war? In particular, I'm curious as to the economic effects that caused it and the economic situation after. Yeah, I'll know a little bit about the Opium War. Well, basically, if you're not familiar with the Opium War, British merchants, British merchant traders, wanted access to Chinese goods. Specifically, tea was the big thing they wanted. They wanted to buy Chinese tea because that was there was a lot of demand for that over in Europe, specifically Britain. The trouble is they didn't really have much to pay for it with. They blew through kind of reserves of silver and gold, and as those dwindled, it was becoming increasingly apparent that they would not be able to buy this tea for lack of anything that they could trade for it, because they just didn't have anything that the Chinese producers wanted. And so they turned to opium. Opium, of course, being a very addictive drug. They started selling it in China, and of course, people got addicted, and so as more and more people got addicted, it became a larger and larger market. So based on the sales they made selling opium, they were able to get basically the money they needed to pay for the tea that they wanted to export to Europe, that they wanted to buy from China. So the Opium War broke out in the early 1800s when the Chinese government, quite understandably, was very upset about this and tried to eject these opium merchants from southern Chinese ports. They seized their ships and basically destroyed their cargoes of opium. Well, the British government didn't take to that very well. They demanded compensation on the part of their merchants, and when the Chinese government refused, a war broke out. Now, this was not like a really even-handed war. I mean, the Chinese army, the Chinese state, I mean, the country as a whole was far, far larger than the British military and Britain itself. And I don't think it was even really the British military that was directly involved. Well, yeah, I guess it was. Basically, the East India Company, such as it was, that was doing this trading, and the British merchants had their own military. But I think the formal British military was brought in. So I think they did fight together during the war. But it was not really a land war per se. It was mostly a naval conflict. Basically, the British Navy blockaded Chinese ports and seized what would become Hong Kong. I think it's called the Kowloon Peninsula, technically. That was seized, and the Chinese forces ejected from it. And based off of the economic dislocation and the seeming ability of the Chinese Navy to break the blockades, the Chinese government ended up signing peace. This is a very truncated version of this history because I don't know the details. This is my understanding of it. And so, because of that treaty, the British ended up with Hong Kong, or at least the southern tip of what would be Hong Kong, the city proper, anyway. They ended up getting the rest of what would become Hong Kong, and I think the second Opium War. I think there were two at least, maybe a third as well. I don't quite remember. But yeah, the economics of it was British traders needing specie, is what it's called, basically needing money to buy Chinese goods. They didn't have it, so they started selling opium to try to get it. And the economic situation after. I don't know that I can comment too much on the economic situation in China after the Opium Wars. I know that the trade in tea exploded. The British started buying significant amounts of tea and exporting that to Europe. And I know that the addiction problem to opium became much worse over time as well. Beyond that, I don't know the whole lot about Chinese economic history in the 19th century, such that I could really comment on the economic after effect of the Opium Wars on the Chinese economy. Let's see, the next one was, now that U.S. debt is over $20 trillion, what is a legitimate way to make progress on that debt? So the biggest parts of the U.S. budget are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the military. That's like the vast majority of the federal budget from year to year. So any effort to substantially reduce U.S. debt pretty much has to reduce most, if not all, of those. And that's a problem because those are all very politically sensitive government expenditures. Generally, when politicians talk about reducing the deficit, the things that they target, the things that they want to reduce government spending on are what's called discretionary spending, generally non-military discretionary spending, and that only makes up like 20-25% of the federal budget. So you're almost certainly not going to be able to make a big dent in deficit spending and the U.S. overall debt just addressing deficit spending. So the best way to deal with it, I mean, if you really wanted to be serious about reducing U.S. debt, you would have to address those things. But those are all very sensitive political entitlement programs, except for the military, which has its own constituency, very powerful constituency. So if you wanted to do something, if you wanted to address the problem in a way that avoids the political difficulties of reducing spending on the military or entitlement programs of one sort or another, you could try something like a spending freeze. So just freeze spending as it is now, and then over time, that would generate a surplus, because you would be, as the economy grows over time, you would generate more tax revenue, but you wouldn't be adjusting spending to grow with the increasing revenue. So you would generate more of a surplus that you could put towards debt or reducing the deficit anyway. Mind you, you don't have to completely get rid of the deficit to reduce debt. So long as if you could keep the deficit small, or at least relatively small, over a long period of time, that would actually reduce debt because of inflation. Inflation reduces the value of debt over time because while the value of the dollar goes down, the absolute value of the debt does not change. So it actually becomes easier to pay over time. So if you could keep debt low, you could actually have inflation eat away a good chunk of that debt over the long term, over the course of like 40, 50 years. So, borrowing $1 billion now sounds like a lot, but 50 years from now, it may be that inflation has eroded the value of that $1 billion such that it's not very hard to pay. So if you could reduce the deficit significantly over a long period of time, keep it that way from year to year, that alone could eat away at the overall debt. You could also just raise taxes a bunch. That's not a very elegant solution, but that would generate a lot more revenue that you could hypothetically all put towards the debt and reducing the deficit. An ideal solution would be to raise taxes moderately and to reduce spending moderately. That's kind of the middle way, and that would generate a decent surplus of revenue that you could put towards reducing the deficit and addressing overall debt. But that's not necessarily great for the economy. Raising taxes and spending, and the government spending less, that's two hits against overall aggregate demand in an economy. So that's generally not recommended unless there's a recession or some other economic downturn.
One of the fun things that you get to balance when you play a Civ builder is also how the people respond to taxes being raised. Because if you're the military leader, government leader, whatever, you have to try and get stuff done. But if your people are all pissed off, they're not going to be quite as productive as citizens. So you need to have enough taxes, but not too much taxing. Otherwise, they will revolt. That's a fun mechanic.
Yeah, it's an accurate mechanic. You know, about making that balance has been a challenge for states, countries, republics, empires all throughout history. And it's not an easy balance to strike. I mean, inevitably, when you change tax policy or spending policy in some way, you're pissing off somebody. So reaching a nice consensus, or at least an equilibrium, is just devilishly difficult in any political system. Let's see, so the next question was, could Mr. Smith shed some light on how the rising public debt bodes for the U.S. economy? It's not necessarily a bad thing, just so long as it's kept under control. Again, you don't have to eliminate deficit spending to reduce debt over the long term. You just have to keep it moderate. And from what I read that this week deficit spending, anyway, had risen significantly. And the reason for that was that there's been a fall in the government receipts from foreign companies that were paying fines. U.S. regulators have been kind of on a spree over the past couple of years going after foreign financial firms of one sort or another, generally in relation to the 2008 financial crisis, but also in relation to other forms of malfeasance. That's generated a couple $2 billion in penalties. So that kind of tailed off this year, and from what I read, that's part of the reason that there's been a lot more borrowing. There's been more deficit spending this year. I don't think it's going to be a problem in the long run or at least even in the medium run for the U.S. economy. I mean, in the 70s, it was more of a problem in the 1970s, kind of 1980s, and certainly before that, because at that time there was less liquidity in international financial markets, such that if a government did borrow a lot of money, that actually did take a lot of money away from the private sector. Basically, the government borrowing money in that era meant that the private sector was not able to borrow that money, and that reduced economic activity. But there's so much liquidity in the financial markets today that it's, government spending as high as it is does not seem to be taking the thunder, so to speak, from the private sector. There seems to be more than enough liquidity roiling around financial markets for everybody. So I don't think it's going to impact the overall economy. It might even be that a little bit more deficit spending might not be a bad thing to help kind of stimulate things. Well, maybe not. Maybe stimulate is the wrong word, but at least help the overall economy, to help aggregate demand. Let's see. Asking for more specifics, and the response was that there's little information. Okay. Yeah, that's off the top of my head. I don't think it's a huge problem for the economy. And in fact, really, there's a lot of one of the criticisms of corporate America right now is that they're not really investing very much in their operations. One of the problems in the private sector is that, for one, there's not as much entrepreneurship as there used to be. There's kind of a stagnation in the rate of startup companies starting up, so to speak. There's sort of been a stagnation in the frequency with which people start businesses. And then at the larger level, at the corporate level, a lot of larger companies are not investing in their operations. They don't really see much room for growth, and so they've been holding back on some investments. There's also other reasons as well, but part of it is just they don't see as much room for growth, and so they don't see much logic or reason to investing in capacity. And so they're not really looking to borrow a lot of money. They're actually sitting on a big stash of cash that they've been building up and are kind of using to pay dividends or stock buybacks or things like that. So even if they did need money, they wouldn't even necessarily need to tap the financial markets. They've got several billion, if not trillion dollars in cash kind of stored away at this point. So then the next question was thoughts on the Bronze Age collapse. I don't know. I could talk a little bit about it, but the thing about the Bronze Age collapse, there was sort of this era in history called the Bronze Age when there was, I think this is roughly Egypt and the Minoan civilization and the Hittites in the Anatolian Peninsula, sort of Eastern Mediterranean civilization, basically. And those were all thriving polities, thriving empires, and there was a thriving international system of trade between them. And then something happened such that most of those civilizations collapsed. The only exception was Egypt. And even Egypt was sufficiently hobbled that it was never really quite the same. It was never as powerful as it was before whatever this event was. And it's kind of a mystery. Nobody really quite knows what it was. There are some theories about it. Some point to natural disasters. Some point to these sea people, such as they were called. Basically, these sort of mysterious raiders, sort of barbarian invaders that traveled over by boat across the Mediterranean and invaded the Anatolian Peninsula, invaded and raided, more like the Anatolian Peninsula, the Levant, and then Egypt. And the theory goes that these people invaded and destroyed these civilizations, and there is some record in Egypt, from ancient Egypt, of a huge battle being fought between the Egyptian military, the Egyptian army, and some coalition of these different groups of sea people. Apparently, there were a bunch of tribes that had banded together for raiding these different places, different cities. And the Egyptian army was barely able to defeat them. So again, natural disasters, volcanoes, earthquakes, what have you, the sea people, maybe climate change. Yeah, those are the theories I can remember off the top of my head. There's also an argument that it's not any one of those. It may be a combination of them all together, kind of all happening over the same period of time. And the concentration of all those factors at once just being too much for those civilizations to survive. It might also be that the sea people were in part themselves motivated by some disaster. It may be that climate change or natural disasters pushed these tribes out of their traditional areas and incentivized them to go on these raids, to become these sort of raiders that subsisted off of stealing, so to speak, attacking and plundering different cities and civilizations. Yeah, beyond that, I couldn't tell you much more than that. That's about the extent of what I know about it. I'm sure somebody more well-read on the subject could go into more detail. Let's see, so the next question was, I would like to ask how order is created and initiated and maintained. For example, in medieval times, you have a hierarchy of classes of people. How did/do we as people decide that these hierarchies exist? And how was status and positioning displayed at the level of being a king or noble? I understand that at that age there is obviously instilling fear of death or slavery, but how does society really even get to that point of hierarchy? That's a deep question.
It seems a little bit connected to the theme of norms that we revisit over and over again, and how the reason that people kind of abide structures that are in place is because they existed before and it's normal to abide by them. That's kind of the standard action, rather than one that is necessarily one that people choose on the fly every time. I'm going to choose to submit to my king today because it's a deliberate choice, so much as that's the expectation. It's the standard expectation in day-to-day life in that era and place. So you don't really question it too much. It's just business as usual.
Yeah, there is kind of an endogenous process through which these kinds of hierarchies naturally evolve over time and are generally they're not very controversial when they're initiated, so nobody really challenges them. It's just sort of the way it is, so to speak. Yeah, questioning how order is created, that's difficult, because that's a broader question than social norms and hierarchies. That's sort of law and order. How does a society become stable? Yeah, that's tough. Well, you could go back to it kind of starts at the local level. We talked a little bit about this before. At the local level, decisions are made by the community. And this is especially true in the ancient era, when communities were much smaller and it was much easier to do collective decision making. So you would reach decisions by consensus, and that, again, easier to do when you're dealing with a smaller community, because generally everybody is kind of a similar mind. Generally everybody kind of agrees broadly on most things, and the differences are relatively minor. So because differences are not so great, easier to reach a consensus agreement on policy.
Yeah, flip side is the UN right now.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect example. So order is achieved at the local level by consensus. Everybody kind of agrees on what to do, and then so long as that agreement is acceptable, everybody is okay and nobody really tries to undermine it. Once you get into something at the level of a nation, or in the ancient era, an empire, then you're talking about groups of localities. So how do you maintain order then in a situation like that? Well, in the ancient era, generally it involved a lot of devolution. It involved a lot of decentralized. The role of national government was just to extract resources, give us some amount of money, where we kill people. So long as you give us money, though, things will be fine. Generally, that's what happened. So the actual, social norms and the day-to-day life and how crimes were punished, just little things like that. Most of that was left to the local level. In so much as laws were passed that were intrusive, generally those were enforced at the point of the spear. Later on, you could say at the point of a gun, basically through violent coercion. So as long as you had a sufficiently powerful force with which to enforce your writ, so to speak, that could work. People might complain, but not a lot they could do. And sort of that implicit threat of violence underlies all laws. That's the government's monopoly on violence. The government is the sole legitimate employer of violence, and it does so on the understanding that it only uses that power to enforce stability, to enforce law. So order, in part, is kind of a social contract in which you agree to give the government exclusive power to exert violence in order to ensure order. So there's that social contract argument. But again, that comes down to local communities kind of agreeing to that. Communities, or national communities, the community at the national level all has to kind of agree to that. That's also part of the social contract. So that's kind of how it's created and maintained over time. It's some authority using violence or threatening violence to ensure order, at the same time that it gives people the right to kind of decide their own affairs to some degree at a local level. The government's legitimacy in that way is derived from not being too intrusive, but providing that law and order. Yeah, in medieval times, law and order was really hard to provide because there were very few central institutions, central states, or governments that were powerful enough to really provide security for people, because there were so many roving bands of barbarians of one sort or another, whether it be Avars, Huns. There were the Arab invasions. That was the early Islamic invasions. There were, all kinds of people from the central steppe of Eurasia coming in. There were Vikings. Very difficult to create a large standing army that could just perpetually be on guard against all those kinds of different groups that were just running around. And it was specifically because of that chaos that medieval hierarchies kind of evolved. Basically, local kings or local barbarians who ended up basically declaring themselves kings would protect people, would protect towns, villages, cities, or even rural areas in exchange for recognition of their authority. And over time, that evolved into what became kings, kingdoms, and feudalism. Sort of the working people of the land working on behalf of kings in exchange for their security. That system stayed in place even as the security situation, so to speak, in Europe improved in the later medieval era. And so kings and whatnot, that medieval hierarchy evolved out of that chaos following the collapse of the Roman Empire. So that's kind of where they got to that point of that hierarchy. That's the genesis of medieval hierarchy. It stemmed from chaos and sort of a early social contract between protectors and farmers or city people. This is a very rough explanation. I'm sure somebody with a lot more background in medieval history could offer a lot more nuance and detail that I'm probably missing. But roughly speaking, this is my understanding. Yeah, this is kind of a multifaceted question, so I'm kind of trying to see what aspects I've addressed and haven't addressed. I guess you could also talk a little bit about feudal system, because the hierarchy in the medieval era goes beyond just kings and peasants. There's also kings, nobles, knights, etc. And basically that all evolved as part of that same process. The king was generally in a given area, a barbarian tribe might move in and provide security. So then the leader of that tribe would become king, and different people who were important in the tribe would be given different bits of land. That would be their land. Technically, it would all still belong to the king, such as the leader of the tribe, but in exchange for the land, those important people in the tribe would promise military service. And so, of course, that evolved into the relationship between kings and nobles. The nobles were wealthy people who owned a lot of land, but who were technically only owned the land on behalf of the king. It was more or less under the king's control. And in exchange for allowing those nobles to have that land, the nobles had to provide military service. They would have to come and fight with the king at his behest. And so then knights, of course, were then the children of nobles, or maybe the nobles themselves. Sometimes they were the children of nobles who were not firstborn sons. If you're a firstborn son, then you inherit the land of your father, and you become the next noble who controls that territory. But if you're a second son or a third son, then you don't get to inherit that land. That's just the way the law worked at that time. Generally, you would then become a knight or become basically a mercenary, or become a priest, or join the priesthood. So it was out of that process of allocating land according to whoever was protecting it early in the medieval era that determined who became nobles, who became kings, and then that process in turn produced priests and knights and peasants and what have you. Again, very rough description, but that's my understanding of it. So, kind of like what Neuro said, it was a very natural evolution that came out of the fall of the Roman Empire. It was a very organic process, so to speak.
It's almost kind of like a selection process. It's not by natural selection. Well, to an extent it is, but once you reach civilization, you can perpetuate your population. It becomes more of a selection of economies. So which systems favor more growth and technology and military and that sort of thing, and how they get to propagate themselves more. Almost like they're their own living entity. It's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, what was it? Kukio used to say, or maybe it was you who used to say that human society is basically one large organism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, society is a manifestation of that organism's characteristics, its nature.
Mm-hmm.
So one part of this question I guess I haven't really addressed. How do we as people decide that these hierarchies exist? Well, if you're a peasant in medieval Europe, you're not going to complain too much if somebody offers to protect you from roving bands of barbarians. So in that sense, they bought into the system and were willing to recognize its legitimacy. A lot of people were not in much position to protect themselves at that time. So people decide that these hierarchies exist partly because there's some initial stage in which there's a contract made of some variety, and then the contract and the nature of the relationship between the people involved in that social contract just evolves over time. How was status and positioning displayed at the level of being a king or noble? I mean, partly it was just through peacocking, I get, kind of having expensive clothes, putting on expensive displays, just general displays of power.
Monty Python and the Holy Grail. How do you know he's the king? Because he'd have shit all over him. Oh. Yeah, being able to clean yourself and stuff like that.
That was part of it. But there was also violence.
Mm-hmm.
If you challenge the rule of the king, or if you're a peasant and you launch a peasant rebellion, you kind of can show your status by violently putting it down, and you have the legitimacy to do that. And that legitimacy in and of itself to use violence to maintain your rule and protect your realm itself is a kind of status. That was something that was assigned to people owing to their royal birth and their historical claim to a given area. Let's see. Yeah, so that's kind of a meandering answer to a deep question. There's probably some bits I'm missing there, but I tried to hit the main points of the questions, as it were. If this person wants me to kind of go into it more, or has some aspect he wants me to elaborate on, you should feel free to state so in the chat. I don't want to leave them unsatisfied, but this is kind of what I have off the top of my head here. So the next question was, as far as voting goes, what do you think of the idea of using a liquid democracy secured by the blockchain? I can honestly say I have no idea what that is. Liquid democracy secured by a blockchain. I would have to read about that for sure, because I've never heard of that before. But thank you for the tip. I'm sure that will make for interesting reading. Yeah, there have been a number of experimental sort of types or variations on democracy that people have contrived over time. I'm guessing this is the latest one. And generally, any political system involves trade-offs. Anything that you can gain by changing a political system in a certain way will almost innately involve you giving up something else, and probably something that you'll miss. So there is generally no great solution to, in terms of changing the structure of political systems. In some cases there is, if there's a blatant flaw somewhere. In that case, yeah, there's obviously a change that could be made for the positive, but generally in mature democracies, it's kind of hard to find flaws like that. There are a few, but, generally people who want to fundamentally change political systems want to do it because they want to change political outcomes in some way, generally in a way that's favorable to their political predisposition. But I don't know that there's a whole lot of changes you can make in, say, the United States or other mature democracies that would really result in a substantive change in the way politics is done. That's a whole nother conversation we could get into. Let's see. So yeah, sorry, I don't know much about liquid democracy, or blockchains for that matter. Kukio might know a lot more about that. If he were still around, he could probably talk at length about it. Let's see, so as a German, the election reminded me that there are a lot of people with questionable, in italics, questionable opinions, as in anti-EU, which does tons more harm than good. And things, in italics, that I don't even want to call an opinion because they are fundamentally false, racism, i.e. There still needs to be interaction/communication within our democratic society, though, since a full, in parentheses, since a full divide of the country's society, be it via violence or ignoring the other party, doesn't seem desirable. How am I supposed to interact with these people? Question mark. It seems hard to argue on a rational level. Yeah, so this kind of goes back to conversations we've had before about sort of liberalism in Europe and the broader developed world and its future, and the threat posed by populist political forces. There's a lot of legitimate criticisms populist political forces bring to the table, and the challenge to liberal status quo is to try to meet those criticisms satisfactorily, such that they are sufficiently pacified that populists don't try to completely blow up the political system and end up making things significantly worse, which is the more likely outcome. I know populists like to say that they're not seeking to blow up the system, they just want to democratize political systems and make them more representative, to make them more accountable. But there are some changes that some of them want to make that are not really in that vein, that would probably not have that effect, and that might actually make governments less accountable and less representative. But that's a whole other conversation. How do you talk with populists? How do you deal with people who are maybe less informed, but generally have a strong belief that government is not representing their views, that they're not being heard? Well, for one, I think you just have to try to understand their worldview, understand their perspective. And I would say that's true of anybody trying to understand somebody of a different political perspective or who has different political opinions. The first step in a conversation is just trying to understand the other person. And if you can try to do that beyond moral judgments, beyond calling them racist or ignorant or what have you, if you can try to understand their view from the point of view of assuming rationality, if you can try to make sense of their point of view, try to make it rational, so to speak, that would go a long way. Because there's a tendency amongst people who bother to try to understand people of a different view, which unfortunately isn't very many people, but even among those people who try to make that effort, there's a tendency to make moral judgments and to kind of write off people of a different political persuasion as being ignorant, as though if they knew what you knew, then they would believe something similar. And that's not necessarily the case. And even if they are ignorant, it really doesn't behoove you to pass moral judgment on them, because that just makes them feel more alienated, and it further radicalizes them. So try to understand them beyond just moral judgments, even if they think something you dislike, or even if they don't know something, even if they are ignorant in some ways. Try to understand their worldview from their perspective. If you knew the things they knew, or don't know the things they knew, or believed the things they believe, would that then make sense, the things that they ask for politically? And generally, you'll find there's generally a fair amount of rationality there. In economics is what you would call bounded rationality. How do you make sense of consumer decisions that are not seemingly rational? Well, if you put in place certain restrictions, if you take away certain assumptions, then actually a lot of decision making is rational once you consider the full set of information that people have, or lack thereof. So once you consider the information set of people within their own context, and don't just assume perfect information, that they know everything and are fully informed. Once you assume that bound, once you put in place those restrictions, then decision making starts to look a lot more rational. So if you can kind of understand them from that perspective, that would help a lot. And at that point, you can take the approach where you try to fill the gaps. If maybe they don't know something, you can give them that information. Maybe that won't change their mind or not, but at least they'll know, and they'll better be able to argument and articulate their position, which is better for national discourse and is more productive in the long run, since people then are not talking past each other, kind of getting caught up on semantics and definitions and things like that. And then, there comes a point when they are informed, and or at least to a degree, and you just have to respect their opinion. They'll just believe something, and fervently, and you just have to say, okay, that's what you believe, and then you just have to negotiate with them. Above and beyond, that's kind of moving past the proselytizing stage. There's a strong impulse amongst a lot of politically active people to try to understand people, not to kind of really fully flesh out the other person's arguments and understand why they believe what they believe in their view. Rather, they just want to understand them so that they can better proselytize them. And it's up to the individual to decide if they want to do that. That's, make of that what you will. That's up to you as the individual. But I think it's more productive to try to at least to make the effort to understand them, and then to respect them. Again, a lot of people don't have particularly respectable opinions from the perspective of other people. I don't expect everybody to fully endorse or render respectable the opinions of people they disagree with, but at least respect their free agency. Don't just say that they're ignorant because of propaganda, because of fake news, etc., etc. Try to assign them some free agency and try to respect them to some degree, and approach them from that angle. And I think if you do that, you'll be more successful in understanding them, and probably also more successful in converting them, in trying to get them to see things from your perspective and making them understand your worldview. And again, they may not in the long run end up agreeing with you. They may not completely convert, but you can at least make them tolerate you. You can at least de-radicalize them, so to speak.
There's the interesting debate concept too, where usually persuasion through debate is going to be most effective on people who are the most moderate. So if they're kind of undecided or in the center, they're more willing to lean one way or the other based on new information that comes in. Whereas a lot of times, the more entrenched you get in a given side, the less you consume of information of both sides, and the more you kind of solidify where you are. So the more extreme someone's position, the less likely they are to do a full switch. And if they do, it would be something that they would have to want for themselves, as opposed to something that you could kind of push them toward.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some people that are going to be innately resistant, who will be hostile to your perspective, or who won't like being proselytized, or who will otherwise not really want to engage in deep conversation. So for people like that, you basically have one of two choices. You can be very confrontational and basically just be in a perpetual political conflict with them. Or you can take the soft approach, the soft touch approach, in which you just try to be as conciliatory as possible and try to be as sympathetic as possible so that you can kind of gain their trust. So that even if they don't agree with you, they at least recognize the legitimacy of your perspective and are willing to engage in dialogue. So those are...
It's
Sorry?
an interesting exercise for me, coming from a very conservative Christian family background and having conversations with them and trying to pick my battles, so to speak, where I'm not going to change their perspective overnight or through one long conversation. I've outed myself as a non-believer of the faith, and there are certain topics like global warming is one where I'm trying to make some progress with my parents and kind of pointing out the evidence and seeing if they're willing to budge on any of those fronts. Everyone kind of has their own little areas where they're not super invested or they don't care or that sort of thing. So being able to identify those areas, it saves you a lot of time and makes the conversations a lot more productive if you can kind of read into those cues of what they really want to hold on to and what they don't really care as much about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good approach. Because one of the key things is respect. One of the problems that modern populists, and the modern populist movement has, is that they have an immense sense of disrespect. They feel like they're marginalized and that people don't like them. There are a lot of people who don't like them, but I think if you can approach them and engage them and make them feel respected, that would be a big improvement. Because a lot of their interactions with people of opposing political views tends to be very confrontational and hostile. Yeah, that's one of the good things I think Angela Merkel has done in Germany. I know I'm mispronouncing her name, but bear with me. Yeah, that's one of the good things she's done, is that with regard to the immigration issue and the spike in support that far-right groups have gotten, stemming from concerns over immigration to Germany, I think she started out being very confrontational. She started out trying to take a tack that this is the right thing to do, we're going to handle this, it's going to be okay. But after a while, when that didn't work and when far-right parties kept growing, she eventually moderated a bit. And I don't think she's really fundamentally changed what she believes about it. She probably still believes what she said initially. She probably still believes immigration is good for Germany and would probably like more of it. But she's taken a different tact, and she's trying to moderate and try to recognize the legitimacy of these concerns about immigration in Germany. And that's about respect. That's about making the people who voted for the AfD, the radical right party, the far right party, let's call it that, in Germany in the recent election. She wants to legitimize those claims, to recognize their legitimacy rather, so that she can make those voters feel like she's respecting them, that she's reaching out to them, that she hears their message, that she hears their concerns, so that they don't feel marginalized, such that they feel that they need to vote for an outside political party, a fringe political party like AfD. That's going to aggravate people who are very adamant about, immigration, that it's a good thing, and who feel that it's the right thing to do. Taking that sort of absolute moral high ground, is kind of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, on the one hand, yes, you can argue that immigration isn't that good and that these people are racist and that they're completely wrong and that they're ignorant and that their views should not be felt in policy making. But that's also the view that's in part fueling that movement, and it's probably only making it worse. So at least by moderating and at least by reaching out to them to some degree, not completely, but to some degree, she's deflating that movement and making it less powerful and making that policy perspective less relevant to the policy-making process. That, I think, is the more effective approach over the long run. And I think it would behoove political groups and people of all political orientations in all countries to kind of take that tack in dealing with political opposition.
One of the things that comes up a lot in Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, is the difference between a rational decision and a good or logical decision, because a rational decision means that people have a position or some beliefs and desires because they have reasons for it. Now, whether the reasons are good reasons or bad reasons, that requires a more rigorous approach. So, with situations like political opposition, a lot of times people won't even give their opponent credit that their reasons are real. Like, they have some purpose for their stance, as opposed to whether that's the best stance. That's more of where the debate can make some progress, where you can make compromises and say, all right, I see that you have this stance for these reasons, I have this stance for these reasons, and we have this common ground where we can make some change for everybody.
Yeah, that's a good summation. What was that book?
How the Mind Works. It's one of the best ones that I would recommend for people who haven't really gone deep in a brain science degree. He puts it in plain language where you don't need to be up to speed with the jargon of how neuroscience talk to each other. He does cover some of that, where you get into the cellular and chemical level, but he builds it up with basic language where you could be studied in any particular field or not really that studied at all, and you can kind of use the blocks that he presents you over the course of the book to kind of understand, as the title suggests, how the mind works.
I had something I was going to say and I blanked out.
That happens. That's actually the sign of a good listener. I've talked with Pact quite a bit about people who you converse with and they don't actually listen to what you're saying. They basically hold in their working memory what they're about to say next. So they're just kind of waiting for you to shut up so that they can have their turn. And that doesn't usually result in very productive conversation. It's more of just two people with some word battles who are looking for the coolest quips to kind of surprise their opponent, as opposed to, I really want to open myself to what you have to say and try and comprehend what these words mean, and then respond to you in an intelligent way that adjusts to your conversation, rather than which great ape can beat their chest and shout the loudest.
Yeah, I can sympathize. I've definitely struggled with that in the past, and probably still do. Oh, yeah, so in politics, even if you're very informed, there comes a point when a policy decision is a judgment call. It's just kind of down to personal preference. And in that case, it's subjective. You know, when policy gets to that point, you can try to point to all of the objective measurements and policy outcomes you want. Ultimately, it'll come down to a subjective preference. So some people will want maximum economic growth, and so they'll want, the policies that correspond therein. But then other people will want to sacrifice some of that economic growth in exchange for other things like social benefits, a welfare state, what have you. And that's not good or bad, that's just a judgment call. Some people prefer to make some trade-offs that others will not want to make. And politics is all about negotiating those differences and reaching a compromise.
Yeah, a big part of decision making is prioritization. It's understanding not just what needs to be done, but what we should do first. And that's really, really tough. Like, just for your daily time expenditure as an individual, but then on the more kind of macro scale of what a country should focus on. Because there's so much to focus on in a given time. You need some basically ordered list of these departments are going to work on these issues. We acknowledge that there are these other issues over here, and these might be our plans, or this is when we might get to them. So being able to level with your constituency and say, all right, I recognize that these are real issues. We're not going to tackle these immediately, but we are going to address them at some point. I think that can allow people to kind of find that common ground and agree on something to focus on, as opposed to if neither party agrees that the issues are real, then everyone hates each other and no progress is made on any front. You get the sort of deadlock.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. So the next one was, would the legalization of assisted suicide / euthanasia be a valid way to combat increased healthcare costs that come with aging populations. It depends on what you mean by valid. That's that's a judgment call. That's a policy judgment call. Some that comes with certain costs that certain people would not be willing to make. Probably most people. Hypothetically, yes, you could deal with increased healthcare costs that come with aging populations that way, if only because most healthcare costs, would not then be incurred if you just kill off most of the older people. If you want to just focus on people who are chronically ill and have it be a volunteer program, probably you would not be able to get enough volunteers for it to really make a dent in overall healthcare costs. Yeah, I don't think there's really a quick and easy solution to dealing with healthcare costs stemming from aging populations. You know, as the demography proportionately becomes older, you end up with just a big bulge in population of elderly people who disproportionately need more healthcare attention, and invariably they spend more. I don't think there's really a good way to lower that spending, and I don't think most people would agree with either with a voluntary soft euthanasia program or a hard cull, so to speak, of the elderly population.
One thing that's kind of interesting that comes along with that is as medicine improves, the quality of life of the elderly improves. So the survival desire of the elderly population improves.
Mm-hmm.
Get a positive feedback loop of people wanting to live longer and longer, and then you have to spend more and more on medicine for the aging population.
Yeah, it's almost kind of a biological diminishing return.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, people kind of already do this. There's no government-mandated point at which they can just cut you off and kill you, per se, at least not in the United States. But insurance companies can be very picky about what treatments they'll let you have that they'll pay for. And, my family actually had some experience with that, so... But anyway, yeah, insurance companies can kind of cut you off at some point. You know, treatments that might be able to extend your life, they can actually deny you based on costs or based on the nature of their coverage. So in that sense, we actually already kind of have this. It's not outright euthanasia, but we do have a process in place where effectively institutions, albeit private institutions, can decide who continues to receive support and who doesn't. And obviously there's a range of activity there that's allowed, but roughly speaking, that's accurate. So let's see, talking on a global historical level, could you talk about the birth and evolution of schools? At a global historical level, that's like a book. You could write a whole book about that. And I would have to do a lot of research to write it, because I don't know nearly enough to completely fill that out. I guess I could talk a bit about schools in the West, in like Europe and the United States. Yeah, let me think.
No, that kind of bumps into what we've talked about with your area of expertise, where you're more focused on more modern, more Western, for broad topics like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I would talk a bit more. I could focus here on public education. And that's going to confuse the shit out of British people, because I know you use that word differently. Government that is paid, schools that are paid for by government. In the United States, that's what we call public schools. Schools that are paid for by government money. And in the United States, they're almost always run by local government. By towns, cities, counties, what have you. They actually kind of, there were some in the 1700s, 1600s, kind of before, but they were really a liberal innovation. Liberalism, again, for the Americans listening, that's classical liberalism. They were a liberal innovation, and they were implemented widely more in the late 1700s, early 1800s. That was kind of the period when liberalism really had its breakout. That was when the American Revolution happened, the French Revolution, and a lot of liberal reforms that had kind of been held up by these staid conservative monarchies were finally implemented, generally relatively broadly. And it was at that point that public education, again by my American definition, was broadly implemented in the West. It took a while for it to be broadly implemented in the United States. We were still kind of a poor country at that time. But in Europe, it spread a bit faster. And it was actually, I think, originally an idea that was the form that it took in Europe and the United States in the terms of like high schools, middle schools, public education generally, of that variety. I think the idea for that had originally come from India. People, or rather kingdoms in India, had institutions like that. I think they were generally more religious, but of course religious institutions in India are very different than religious institutions in the West. They tend to be a little less doctrinaire, a little less dogmatic, and a little more broad, and to focus a little more on science and philosophy and things like that. Although, to be fair, there were a lot of Christian institutions that did that as well, but relatively speaking, less religious dogma in Indian institutions of that variety. So anyway, liberals kind of already had notions of public education in the West, I believe. This is my rough understanding. But they were inspired by the Indian example in particular, and so it was the Indian example that kind of formed the framework for what would become public education in Europe and the United States in the 1800s. And from there, it just became broader and broader because, of course, everybody wanted their kids to have good education. And so government expanded that, the ambit of public education with that demand, especially after governments became more democratic and more responsive to voters. Specifically more so in Western Europe, France, the Low Countries, Britain, etc. As those countries became more democratic and as suffrage, that is to say the right to vote, expanded to broader swaths of the population, there was greater and greater demand for education, and so the states responded by providing that. And so that sort of period of the late 1800s laid the groundwork for modern public education, where you have high schools and, in the case of Europe, technical schools and whatnot. And that's pretty much been the model ever since, in terms of primary education anyway. I guess you could get into secondary education as well. That would be a whole other discussion. But this person mentioned the evolution of schools, so I assume they mean primary education, as in things like elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, that level of education. So roughly, that's the birth and evolution of schools in the West. That's an extremely truncated, simplified history of schools in the West. I don't think I could go much beyond that. I think I would have to read a lot more about it. I know that there had been, before public education, again, American definition, before there was broad public education, there had been a lot of private schools. That is to say, privately funded, non-government schools that took pupils, but generally those were very small and accessible only to relatively well-off people. I think if you were poorer and you wanted to get educated, generally you would get something like an apprenticeship. And even then, there weren't a whole lot of those. Most people generally were rural, lived in agricultural areas. Lived in rural areas practicing agriculture, let's put it like that. Proper grammar. Something close to proper grammar, anyway. Let's see, so the next one was, how did the USA end up with an almost exclusively dual-party system, and do I believe that other parties will rise in the future? This is getting to be the new... Yeah, Brazil is a good example of that. Yeah, this is getting to be like the new cryptocurrency question. Multiple political parties in the United States.
I had a lot of those questions when I was taking my first political science courses, because you kind of run into that issue of, are they just pushing and pulling too hard on either extreme and they can never compromise on anything? And over time you kind of see that that's sort of the ebb and flow of two main political cultures that are kind of vying for power, and then the overall governance ends up being what should be an average of what people want in the country. What you've talked about recently with Brazil is the polar opposite extreme of, well, what if you just had a ridiculous number of political parties? Would that be better? And it seems like not really. If you have too many weak parties, then no one accomplishes anything. Versus China, which would be if you have a single party that controls everything, what does that look like? So we have a bunch of different running experiments on the planet of how many political parties is the best number. There isn't really a clear answer for that. Two seems to be decent. It's not perfect. The flaws end up being more in the execution of the system as opposed to the system itself and corruption and that sort of thing. How effectively the representatives serve their constituency.
Yeah, that's actually exactly where I was going to go. It's not so much the number of parties, it's more institutions, it's more political systems and political culture. That's more important. You know, you can have a two-party system that's very representative and very sensitive to the needs of voters, but the degree to which it does that is a function of the overarching political infrastructure. In Brazil's case, you have a lot of political parties, not very functional. In the case of China, one political party that's relatively functional, but also same problems with accountability and corruption, for that matter. So, and in turn, in the United States and Europe, you have examples of two-party systems and multi-party systems that work relatively well. Again, that's down to institutions. Let me see. So, specifically, he asks about, or she asks about, how did we end up with an exclusively dual-party system? Well, part of that, I think part of that, and you would really need to talk to a political scientist for a better answer to this, because they could flesh this out a lot better than I can. But from what I understand, part of it just comes down to the electoral system. Well, that has a different meaning in the United States, so maybe I shouldn't put it like that. But we have what's called a first-past-the-post system in the United States. So representatives to Congress, either at the national or state level generally, they're elected based on districts. The territory is cut up into different districts, and each district elects its own representative. And first past the post means that whoever gets the most votes wins. So that's a lot different than a proportional system where you wouldn't have districts per se. You would just have everybody vote, and then the number of seats that given political parties get are assigned according to what proportion of the vote they got. So if a political party A gets 50% of the vote, they would get 50% of the seats in parliament. And if political party B got 25% of the votes, they would get 25% of the seats in parliament. That's a proportional system. Here in the United States, we don't have a system like that. It's more just districts. Districts vote for their representatives. And so in turn, the institutional problem that we face here in the United States is there's a huge incentive to design districts to draw their borders in ways that guarantee certain political outcomes. So if people in given territories all tend to vote for your political rivals, you have an incentive to try to lump all of those territories into one single district, so they have one single representative. And then in turn, you have an incentive to take all the territories that vote for you and cut those into as many different districts as possible, so that you have as many different representatives of your party, of your political view, as possible. So that's called gerrymandering. That's the word we have for it here in the United States. And there's a long-running dispute about that here. That's an institutional problem. Hypothetically, you could draw the districts in a relatively fair, equitable way. There are people that have ideas about how to do that, but it's a very sensitive subject politically, because obviously political groups that are dominant in a given state don't want to give up their gerrymandered districts. So that's a difficult problem to solve. Anyway, that's kind of how that came to be. When you have a system like that, where you have first past the post voting predicated on districts, it doesn't really matter. Proportional voting isn't as meaningful in that sense. Basically, Everybody votes for who they want to represent their interests. Those people go on to the national or state level. And because the districts are generally small, generally it's easier to find people that everybody in that district can agree on. There's generally a degree of consensus. And so different political parties in turn just dominate individual districts. Because again, there's generally, especially if you're talking about early 1800s America, these districts are not heavily populated and there's not a lot of diversity in them. There's not a lot of like divergent political opinions. And this goes back to what I was talking about before with communities being homogenous and it being easier to reach consensus at a community level. These districts are generally pretty close to a community level, or at least an agglomeration of very similar communities. And so when people in these communities vote, they generally all vote for the same people or the same kinds of people. So that lends itself to just a few parties, because you don't have a whole multitude of different people voting for different opposing viewpoints. What happens in the United States, to kind of give an example of this, because I'm sure people are wondering, you know, is there not a huge political spectrum in the United States? Do you not have a lot of different people believing in different things on the political left and on the political right? So is there not a left wing of the Democratic Party and a right wing of the Democratic Party? And a left wing and a right wing of the Republican Party? In Europe, all those different wings would just have their own parties. Here in the United States, they kind of fall under individual parties. And the way that happens is different parts of the country, generally relatively homogenous, create coalitions, broader national coalitions. They reach out to people who are of similar mind or who have similar interests or who are at least not outright opposed to their interests, and they form broader coalitions. So in a way, you could say that the broad political coalitions of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party represents a geographic coalition of different groups across the nation. That's more how political differences manifest within a system like the United States. You can kind of see something similar in the United Kingdom, which has more political parties than the United States. The United States actually has like 10 political parties, but only 2 that matter. The United Kingdom is kind of similar. There are 2 political parties that really matter, and then maybe 2 more that kind of matter. And part of that stems from their having a similar system. They have a system that's dependent on elections and first past the post elections in individual districts. So again, this is a very simplified answer, and I'm not doing a great job of it, I'm sure. A political scientist or somebody more well-versed could flesh it out more. But basically, when you have a system like that with districts and first past the post systems, there's not a lot of political competition within those districts. They're relatively homogenous. And so you end up with just one party basically dominating in them. Relatively little competition. And so there's just not much of a need for a whole bunch of political parties to prop up. And then in turn, different political views are manifested in politics by broad geographic coalitions of all these different representatives from different districts kind of banding together. I might add that part of the way we deal with this in the United States is having a very decentralized political system of political parties. In Europe, and in a proportional system, political parties are very powerful. They generally decide who represents which districts that they win in. Well, no, that's the United Kingdom. In a proportional system, rather, the political parties decide who they put in parliament. It's not really up to the voters, per se. And in the United Kingdom, the political parties are relatively strong compared to the United States. They'll generally take people from a given community, from a given district, and have them run as the party's rep, but the party can totally remove you if it wants. In the United States, it doesn't work like that. It's very bottom-up. It's very decentralized. If you want to run for a spot in a district, some political position, you generally don't have to get permission to do that. It can help you to get permission, because then they'll agree to give you money to help finance your campaign, but you don't have to. And a lot of people, especially at the lower level, at the level of local government and to a lesser degree state government, generally will just kind of fund their own campaigns. They'll just do their own thing. And so because of that, it's much easier to get into a political party. You can just kind of claim to represent the Republican or Democratic Party, regardless of how closely you hew to the national level policies. Basically, you just design your campaign to cater to local interests. And whether the national level or state level of Democrat or national Republican Party likes that or not doesn't really matter. So long as you can win, they'll generally accept you. The evolution of who votes for Democrats and Republicans in the United States is you can kind of trace major historical events in the United States and major changes in the economy and the geographic distribution of the country's demography and economic power, how that's distributed throughout the country. That's reflected in how people vote for Republicans and Democrats and how that changes over time. So you can almost see the changes in the American economy and demography just by looking at how districts vote over time. So overall, generally, district representatives are very responsive to their constituents. The question is, how do you design those districts in a way that makes society as representative as possible? That's a debate. That's an ongoing debate. But we do have representative democracy, so to speak. It's not as though it's a complete oligarchy, as some people have criticized the United States for being. There is some merit to that argument, but I don't think the electoral system is really part of that, per se. So that's a long-winded, meandering answer that probably has a lot of holes in it. It's, again, not quite my area of expertise. But in general, I'm not of the mind that if the United States had more political parties, that democracy would improve, or more people would be represented, or things would substantively change. I think you would broadly end up with the same political equilibrium in the United States that we have now. Maybe people would feel better if they could vote for a party that specifically represented their specific beliefs, but again, I don't think anything substantive would really change overall. You would still have the same constituencies broadly across the country. They would still probably elect much the same politicians, and you would probably end up with much the same distribution of politicians. Something that people forget is that if Texas were to implement proportional voting in terms of allocating its seats in Congress, there would be more Democrats, there would be more leftist Texas representatives at the national government. But presumably the whole country would do the same thing, so in California you would end up with a lot less Democrats and a lot more Republicans. So I think overall the change would probably balance out. I don't think there would be a significant change in that regard. And ultimately you would still have to make the same compromises, you would still have the same debates about government spending, about government policy in general, just all of the debates we have now would still happen. And I don't think the way the seats are distributed at the national or state level would really change significantly enough to represent to break the deadlock, so to speak, in the current national politics. If I did not also add that because we have two large political parties in the United States, they also tend to go out of their way to push and support little laws, not big regulations, but little regulations that make it harder for smaller parties to operate. So one of the requirements to get on the ballot for a given election at the state level and the national level is that you have to have something like, generally the law differs depending on the state, but you have to get a certain number of signatures on a document, a petition, in order to legally apply for it, in order to get legal recognition that allows you to be on the ballot. And the number of signatures required is generally very high, and it's very difficult for smaller parties that don't have very many resources to reach that goal. And then there's a lot of other little regulations that I don't remember as well that also kind of impede smaller parties in that regard. But I don't think that if you removed those, smaller parties would necessarily do better. Again, generally the people who run for the Democratic or Republican parties in local districts, in national, local, state, whatever level elections, generally those people are very sensitive to the desires of their district. They try to run on those desires as much as possible. So I don't think if you suddenly had proportional voting, you would end up with a lot more people who are very accountable. Or necessarily, you might end up with something that reflects the diversity of the electorate more, but again, I think that if you did that nationwide, the distribution would not significantly change, and you would end up with the same broad political equilibrium that we have now. I don't think you would be able to do anything in a proportional system that you can't do with the system we have now in that regard. Put it like that. And of course, you're free to disagree. I'm sure chat is doing that now. I'm sure plenty of people, because I know people have very strong opinions about proportional voting and about the American electoral system and how it needs to change and be more this, that, or the other. So I don't think structural change in this regard is going to do that, but again, that's kind of subjective. So I leave that to the individual to decide for themselves. Let's see. Where were we? Oh, here we go. Could you explain what would happen if the East... Could you explain what would happen if the East calls on the U.S. debt? I'm guessing China and East Asia. To fully flesh out the idea, a lot of people talk about wanting to lower the national debt, but in my mind, I can't imagine anyone calling on that debt and requesting it to be paid before continuing commerce. Yeah, this person is correct in the sense that nobody is just going to arbitrarily say, hey, you have to pull back my debt, you have to pay back all the debt. You know, all the money we lent the United States has to be paid back right now. For one, that's impossible. You can't do that. The way that the debt is issued at the national level is in the form of bonds. And a bond is basically a contract that says you'll pay back this money either over the course of a set amount of time or at the terminus of a set period of time. And generally, treasury bonds, which is the principal form of bond that the government borrows money through, is 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. I think those are the major types of bonds there are. So there's no way for you to just arbitrarily say, if you're holding a treasury bill or a treasury bond, I want my money right now. Well, you can't do that. When you bought the bond, you basically signed a contract that said you're going to wait until such and such time to get your money. So nobody can just call U.S. debt like that. Little danger from that. There is sort of this argument that there's too much debt held, too much U.S. debt specifically. This is an argument in the United States, obviously. There's this argument that too much U.S. debt is held by foreigners, and that the United States is in some kind of danger because those foreigners, i.e. China is the one they generally point out. There's some fear that China could just massively sell off all of its U.S. Treasury bills, which would decrease the value and significantly raise interest rates, and it would be impossible for the United States to borrow, and it would be basically amount to like an economic attack on the country. That's not a danger. China doesn't hold enough treasury bonds to do that. If they did sell off, yeah, interest rates would rise a bit, but there's a lot of demand for treasury bonds in the market, in the international market. It's kind of the baseline for secure investment. It's considered the safest investment you can make. So if you sell off a whole shit ton, then what's going to happen is that people are going to buy a whole shit ton. So temporarily, the price would increase. That is to say that the interest rate would increase. Well, actually, that would be a decrease because they would be selling off. So the price would decrease, meaning the interest rate would rise, but that would be temporary. Eventually, a new equilibrium would be reached, and that would probably involve interest rates going down to pretty much what they were before. So I wouldn't worry about that. That's not really a big danger. So that's what would happen if the East called, so to speak, on the U.S. debt. If they tried to have it paid back all at once. For one, they can't, but even if they could, other countries or economic actors in the international market would probably just buy it. So I don't think that's a disaster in the waiting, so to speak. And I didn't actually finish this other guy's question. He also asked, did I believe that other parties will arise in the future in the United States? Probably not. We've already got a number. More likely would be that it's easier for the smaller parties, like the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or some of the others, to compete on a more even keel with the two big parties. That's more likely than a whole bunch of new parties. If you're asking, is it likely that we'll have a proportional system that will allow a lot of multiple political parties? Almost certainly not. The United States can barely govern its way out of a paper bag right now, let alone take on something as big as a massive electoral reform that would probably require constitutional amendments. So, no, I don't think that's in the near to medium future, and probably not even in the long-term future.
Another thing to point out, too, is how the major parties can undergo really big changes kind of in the culture of what they're pushing. So, like, Trump running Republican and Bernie Sanders running Democrat are both kind of different than the establishment candidates that have been normally running.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the system does have flexibility in that regard. You know, you can run as an insurgent candidate and represent that part of the electorate, so it's quite feasible. So let's see, this was the last question. Oh, that was the last question. Okay. So is that it for time, or did we have some more to work with?
We have about 5 minutes if you want to cover some stuff.
Gosh, what to choose? I have this big backlog of stuff. Let's see, what would be good? Well, a couple weeks ago, Turkey bought a Russian missile defense system, which was bizarre. It's very unusual for NATO member states to buy military defense systems from outside that are not made in NATO countries. Certainly from Russia in particular. And military procurement is a very political process. Countries generally do it to signal to other countries or to otherwise entrench ties with other countries. So this is kind of a sign of the Turkish government reaching out to Russia and trying to deepen ties between them. It's going to be really hard to integrate Russian defense systems with NATO systems. They're very different. So there's also this question about whether Turkey is kind of moving away from NATO. This might be a signal that they're kind of shifting strategically away from NATO solidarity and moving into a more autonomous, independent track. That said, it's kind of debatable how deep relations go between Russia and Turkey and how deep they can go. They have very different visions for the region. The Turkish government obviously has a much more Islamist vision for the region, whereas Russia is more status quo. They also compete for influence in the region. Obviously, Syria is the big example there, but also more widely. Turkey is very much kind of on the Qatar side of Middle Eastern affairs, whereas Russia sides more with the Iranian/Syrian bloc of countries. So they could have reached this could also be a sign that they've reached an agreement on respective spheres of influence. So this could have been part of a deal in which they basically said, all right, we're kind of at a stalemate in Syria, so here's your sphere of influence, here's yours, and let's kind of tone things down. That could be a good sign if you want the Syrian war to draw down. That could mean the war there is kind of in its final stage. So in that sense, it's a good sign. But certainly it's a very significant development in the diplomatic position of Turkey vis-a-vis Russia and NATO. And then one last question to throw in: how do you feel about central basic income? I'm guessing that's a well, we've talked about that before, so I'll skip that since we've only got a few minutes.
Universal basic income?
Yeah, I think that's more what they mean. And then the other one was, doesn't the non-representative election system mean that the U.S. is by definition not a democratic country? No, not really. I think it is a democratic country, and it does have a representative system. It just doesn't have a proportional system. You know, there's a lot of districts in the United States, so everybody, all the different communities in general kind of get a voice. The question is, how do you distribute power between those different groups? And because you can arbitrarily cut up communities into these different districts in certain ways, they don't have as much representation as they would otherwise. But I don't think you could say it's not a democratic country. I think it does have a representative form of government. Oh, there was one thing. Last week we talked a little bit about the big three ratings agencies. And somebody was asking about basically the credit bureaus. These are the institutions, let me see, TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax, that report on individual credit. Basically, when you want to borrow a loan, they do a background check and collect information on you and then give you a credit score. That's the big three credit rating agencies. I actually wasn't aware that there was also a big three credit rating agencies that do different things. They actually rate international debt, countries' debt, corporate debt, what have you. And that big three is Moody's, S&P, and Fitch and Group. And that's the group that was actually more involved with the 2008 financial crisis. They were the ones who were rating a lot of those derivatives, a lot of those very complicated securities, and giving them, very high ratings when really they didn't deserve high rating. That's the big three with relation to that. So those are two different big three credit rating agency groups. And actually they're Moody's, S&P, and Fitch and Group are the credit rating agencies, and then TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax are the credit reporting agencies. That was a distinction I wasn't aware of until I read chat last week, so I thought I'd bring that up.
Cool.
Also thanks to the people in chat who did bring it up and brought it to my attention.
Oh, we got a couple more minutes. I just did one quick play around, so we'll see. It might be another 3 to 5.
Ooh, okay. Let me see what I can squeeze in. I think I've got some shorter ones in my notes. There's a new malaria superbug in Southeast Asia, and that's proving very resistant to traditional malaria treatments. I have in my notes that it has a 60% failure rate, and that could be catastrophic for tropical regions that have historically suffered from malaria, in particular Africa, where there's what I think I read that 92% of malaria cases occur in Africa. So a resistant form of malaria could be immensely destructive to tropical regions like Southeast Asia and Africa. Being able to treat tropical diseases like that has been a huge economic boon for tropical regions of the world, because it lowers mortality, it lowers health costs, and by doing so, it allows human capital to improve. People can focus more on education, they can spend less of their money on healthcare, and in general, they can be a lot more productive. So it's helped tremendously in the economic development of tropical countries. But if a resistant form of malaria were to crop up and spiral out of control, from what I read in the article, it could kill as many as several million people per year by 2050. And obviously that would be a huge tragedy and humongous setback for developing countries in that tropical zone. Oh, Donald Trump has been making noise about the Iran nuclear deal. So the United States can't really leave the Iran nuclear deal, such as it was. If you don't know what the nuclear deal was, it was a negotiation that the United States carried out with UN Security Council partners, as well as other major powers around the world, with regard to imposing international sanctions on Iran. Obviously, the United States already had sanctions on Iran because of its nuclear program. But the triumph of the Iran nuclear deal was to get every other major country in the world to impose sanctions on Iran as well. And that was very significant, because Iran depended a lot on other countries besides Europe and the United States for trade and for foreign revenue. So because of the weight of the international sanctions that were brought because of that deal, Iran was finally kind of brought to the table and was willing to, was able to reach that deal. I should say that before the deal, rather. This international sanctions were agreed before the deal. That's what brought Iran to the table, and that led to the nuclear deal, which eased those sanctions in exchange for Iran backing off of its nuclear program. Donald Trump is very critical of this deal. A lot of people actually have been, not just Donald Trump, but also people in the foreign policy establishment. And they want to, well, Donald Trump in particular wants to just leave the deal, or at least that's what he sounds like he wants to do. Kind of can't do that, because even if the United States reimposed a lot of these sanctions that it eased as part of the deal, that doesn't mean that the other countries that were part of the deal also have to reimpose sanctions. And ultimately, it was countries like China, Russia, India that imposed sanctions on Iran that really were responsible for pushing them to reach this deal. So if China, Russia, and India don't reimpose sanctions after the U.S. quote-unquote leaves the nuclear deal, then it's not going to matter. It's not going to offer substantive change. And the Iranian government has already come out and said that if the United States did renege on the deal, then they would just, well, basically they would still stick to the deal. They wouldn't care. It would still be in effect. The United States does have a nuclear option. It could impose SWIFT banking sanctions. SWIFT banking is the sort of system, the international electronic system by which banking transactions are verified and okayed. That system is basically in the United States and subject to American regulation, and the United States government can prevent targets of sanctions from using that system. And that's a very extreme measure to take, and it's been very effective in preventing people on sanctions lists from using the international financial system. The thing is, the SWIFT banking system is worldwide. So when the United States imposes a restriction like that, that applies to everybody, not just people living in the United States or American companies. And so people are very sensitive about that. It's not something you want to use arbitrarily. So I don't think the Trump administration will go that far. And if they did, that would really accelerate attempts by other countries to try to set up an alternative to SWIFT banking system that would not be subject to the tender mercies, so to speak, of the American regulators. How am I doing?
Keep going.
Keep going. Let's see. So there was progress on the Brexit talks as well. Prime Minister May was in Italy and gave a speech in which she made a major proposal, basically, in which she said that the United Kingdom could stay in the European Union for an additional 2 years after it technically left, basically to avoid what's called a cliff edge scenario, in which the United Kingdom's economy would be subject to the sudden shock of losing access to the single market. So a lot of the political and bureaucratic minutiae of leaving the European Union would go into effect when the United Kingdom left the European Union, but this deal would involve the United Kingdom maintaining access to the single market, the European Union single market. In exchange, the United Kingdom would continue to make contributions to the European Union budget, specifically with regard to decisions that had been made while it had voting power. So that would actually help resolve the major sticking point in the negotiations thus far, which is the so-called divorce bill, which the European Union had been asking for, ranging in tens of billions of euros, that they wanted the United Kingdom to pay as part of the separation. Basically, the United Kingdom would pay a portion of that. It's not as much as what the European Union is asking for, but the United Kingdom would pay some amount of money into the European Union budget in exchange for this right to maintain access. So that's a major proposal, and that does address some of the major sticking points, and it could be a framework going forward, and it could allow, if the European Union agrees to it or some version of it, that could allow negotiations to continue on to the next stage, finally, regarding what exactly the terms of the United Kingdom's access to the market will be once it formally leaves the European Union. Prime Minister May also said that she wanted to continue pre-existing security arrangements with the European Union. The EU may or may not be willing to do that. I imagine they would. I don't think that's a very controversial sticking point in the negotiations. And then she also said that she wanted to let EU migrants living in the United Kingdom stay on, but that they would have to register. The European Union is okay with that in principle. It just doesn't want those registration requirements to be too restrictive, to be too oppressive. And it also wants, in exchange for a continued permanent access to the single market, beyond just a 2-year temporary access, if the United Kingdom wants permanent access to the single market, one of the conditions the European Union has said is that the United Kingdom rather, has to allow some degree of free movement of labor, some degree of free movement of European Union nationals into the United Kingdom to work. So one last question. Why does none of the notable global political leaders go to North Korea and ask Kim Jong-un what he wants? Everybody knows what Kim Jong-un wants. That's not a mystery. What he wants is to have nuclear weapons to act as a deterrent against the United States, because there's a very real concern on the part of North Korean government that either the United States or some other power could eventually, for whatever reason, lose its shit and start a conflict with North Korea. It also acts as a great deterrent against little things, little subversions against the North Korean government. If you're afraid that the North Korean government might, in the event of a regime collapse or in the event of some other major geopolitical event, if you're afraid that they might, in those circumstances, use nuclear weapons, you're much less inclined to do little things to subvert the government's power. You have actually some interest in maintaining the government power. This is actually the dilemma faced by the United States with regard to Pakistan, which is kind of a frenemy. It's kind of both ally and opponent. And the United States, if Pakistan did not have nuclear weapons, might not have a problem undermining the government and putting a lot of pressure on it. But because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, there's a fear that if the government, that if the United States pushed too hard, that the government might then collapse, and that those nuclear weapons could end up in the quote-unquote wrong hands. That you don't really know what would happen to them. There's a similar dynamic at play with North Korea. Having nuclear weapons is just not only offers the deterrence of a weapon of mass destruction. It also offers the deterrence of what would happen to those nuclear weapons if your regime collapsed. You can almost threaten major powers with the collapse of your regime if you have nuclear weapons. You can say, don't mess with me too much, because if my regime collapses, you don't know where these nuclear weapons will end up. So it's a general deterrent against not just outright aggression, but also subversion from outside. So in that sense, I don't think somebody going to North Korea and talking to Kim Jong-un is going to discover some new desire or new impulse or new motivation on his part that might serve as a breakthrough in negotiations.
$99 to $99 for stuck at overtime. One of those games where it's like, it could go for 5 minutes, it could go for 15 minutes, and it's one of those where it almost ended, but then our team gave him a volley, and now it's just a battle of the fates until Judgment Day and the trumpets sound. Packfax just wants to relax for the evening. And I'm pretty tired too. Today was one of those days where your brain basically knows what you want to do, but your hands don't really agree. They're not on the same page.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yep. Being a human being. And
Well, I
you
thought
win.
this was kind of... Oh,
Nice.
there you go.
Thank you, Moonsilver, for dropping the donation for Agent Smith. We got multiple hosts during the show as well, which was nice for the viewership. Good having you on as usual.
Well, thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward to having you on next time.
Yep, looking forward to it.
And keep it real.
Yep. You too. Have a good night.
GG.